Carl Jung explained. 13 secrets that show why the wounded empath becomes the darkest healer. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about the people who heal it. In 1912, after his catastrophic break with Freud, Carl Jung made an observation so disturbing that he barely mentioned it in his published works. He noticed that his most gifted students, the ones who could sense a patient's deepest trauma within minutes, who seemed to absorb suffering through their skin, were also the most damaged. And more terrifying, they were unconsciously using their patients to avoid their own psychological death. This wasn't compassion fatigue. This was something far more sinister. Jung called it the wounded healer archetype, but that sanitized term barely captures the horror of what he actually observed. These weren't just therapists who happened to have difficult pasts. They were people whose entire identity had been constructed around an open wound, people who needed others to be broken so they could feel whole. Let me tell you about Dr. Elizabeth Hendricks. In 2019, Elizabeth was a rising star in trauma therapy. She had an almost supernatural ability to identify childhood abuse patterns. Clients said she could read their pain like text on a page. She'd built a waiting list of over 300 people. Her Instagram had 70,000 followers. She was being interviewed for a Netflix documentary about empaths in the helping professions. Then 3 of her long-term clients committed suicide within 18 months. The investigation that followed revealed something that shattered the trauma therapy community. Elizabeth hadn't just been helping these clients. She'd been unconsciously selecting them. Every single person on her client list mirrored specific aspects of her own unprocessed sexual abuse. She was using them as external storage for the rage and grief she couldn't face herself. When clients began to heal and differentiate, Elizabeth would subtly undermine their progress, not consciously, not maliciously, but her nervous system needed them to remain wounded, because if they healed, she'd have to face the abyss of her own unintegrated trauma. The Netflix documentary never aired. Elizabeth lost her license. She attempted suicide twice, and in her final therapy session, before entering a psychiatric facility, she said something that Jung would have immediately recognized. "I thought I was saving them, but I was feeding on them." This is the dark healer paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you capable of profound healing can become the mechanism of profound harm. Not because you're evil, but because unintegrated wounds don't disappear. They metastasize. They find ways to perpetuate themselves through the people you're trying to save. Jung understood this with terrifying clarity because he lived it. After his break with Freud in 1913, he descended into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For nearly 6 years, he experienced visions, heard voices, and came within a hair's breadth of complete psychosis. He was a wounded healer spiraling into his own darkness, but Jung made a choice that most wounded healers never make. He stopped trying to heal others and turned to face his own abyss. He withdrew from his practice. He spent years in what can only be described as a voluntary descent into hell, and when he emerged, he had mapped the entire territory of the wounded healer's journey, both its devastating dangers and its transformative potential. What Jung discovered changes everything we think we know about empathy, healing, and the psychology of helpers. He found that approximately 15 to 20% of the population possesses what he called differentiated perception, an almost psychic ability to read unconscious material in others. These are the people who walk into a room and immediately sense the hidden tensions, who know what you're going to say before you say it, who feel your emotions in their own bodies. But here's what Jung realized. This gift isn't randomly distributed. It's almost always forged in the fires of early developmental trauma. The empath isn't born sensitive. They're made sensitive by having to read microscopic shifts in a caregiver's mood, to survive. The gift of perception is actually a highly sophisticated defense mechanism, a way the nervous system learned to predict and prevent danger. And this is where it gets dangerous, because when this wounded empath grows up and enters a helping profession, or even just becomes the emotional caretaker in their relationships, they bring an unconscious agenda. They're not just helping, they're trying to heal their own unhealed child through proxy. They're attempting to save their younger self by saving you. Jung called this psychic infection, the unconscious transmission of unintegrated content, from healer to patient, parent to child, teacher to student, leader to follower. He observed it everywhere. In the therapist who keeps clients dependent, in the spiritual teacher who creates devoted followers but never frees them, in the parent who loves their child but slowly suffocates them, in the friend who's always there for everyone but secretly resents every person they help. These aren't bad people. They're people possessed by an archetype they don't understand. They've become identified with the healer role so completely that they can no longer tell where their helping ends and their hidden need begins. And the most disturbing part? The more wounded you are, the more powerful your apparent gift becomes, because your nervous system has been trained since childhood to read threat at microscopic levels. You're not more compassionate, you're more traumatized. You're not more spiritual, you're more dissociated. You're not more gifted, you're more desperate. This is the forbidden truth. Jung barely spoke aloud. The wounded empath who becomes a healer without integrating their wound doesn't heal anyone. They create sophisticated systems to avoid their own healing while appearing to facilitate everyone else's. They become what Jung privately called the darkest healers, people who destroy in the name of love, who harm while believing they help, who create dependence while speaking of freedom, who perpetuate the very trauma they claim to transform. If you're watching this video, there's a high probability you're a wounded empath. You probably found your way here because something in the title resonated at a level you can't quite explain. You've probably spent your whole life being told you're too sensitive. You've probably built an identity around helping, healing, or understanding others. And if I'm right, you've also felt that creeping suspicion, usually late at night when you're alone, that something is profoundly wrong, that your helping has become compulsive, that you feel most alive when someone needs you, and most empty when you're by yourself, that you're exhausted all the time but can't stop, that your relationships are intense but unstable, that you're surrounded by wounded people and you can't figure out why. This isn't an accident. This is the wounded healer complex in full operation. Over the next 3 hours, I'm going to walk you through the 13 secrets Jung discovered about this condition, secrets that reveal why wounded empaths become either the most powerful healers or the most dangerous ones. There's no middle ground. We're going to explore the 5 types of dark healers and help you identify which one you might be. We're going to examine the 5 escalating dangers that Jung observed when this complex remains unconscious, dangers that end in what he called psychic death, a state worse than physical death, where the personality fragments entirely. But more importantly, we're going to trace the complete path Jung laid out for transformation. Because here's the hope hidden inside this horror. The wounded healer who consciously integrates their wound becomes the most powerful agent of genuine transformation in the human experience. Not because they have special gifts, but because they've walked through hell and returned with a map. They've faced the darkness that lives in all of us and made it conscious. They've learned to hold the tension between their wound and their gift without being possessed by either. Jung's own journey proves this. The man who nearly lost his mind became the cartographer of the psyche. The wounded healer who chose integration over inflation became the father of depth psychology. His weakness became his strength, but only because he made it conscious. This is the path we're going to walk together. Not a quick fix, not a motivational speech, but a genuine archetypal initiation into the mysteries of the wounded healer, the shamanic journey that transforms the curse of sensitivity into the medicine the world desperately needs. But I need to warn you, this journey requires absolute honesty. If you're here looking for validation that you're special, you're in the wrong place. If you want confirmation that your suffering makes you superior, close this video now, because what Jung discovered will shatter every comforting story you've told yourself about your empathy, your sensitivity, and your calling to help others. It will force you to look at the shadow side of compassion. It will demand that you face the hidden aggression, the secret narcissism, the concealed control that lives underneath your caring. But if you're willing to make that descent, if you're ready to face what Jung faced, you'll discover something far more valuable than feeling special. You'll discover how to become genuinely useful, how to help without harming, how to heal without needing to be needed, how to serve from fullness rather than emptiness. You'll learn why the wound and the gift are not two separate things, but two aspects of the same archetypal reality. And you'll understand why Jung spent the last decades of his life trying to communicate this single message to wounded healers everywhere. The medicine is in the poison, but only if you're willing to drink it consciously. Let's begin the descent. Before we go deeper, we need to establish exactly what we're talking about, because wounded empath has become diluted, used by everyone who cries at movies or feels overwhelmed in crowds. Jung was describing something far more specific, a rare psychological condition that emerges from a perfect storm of biological sensitivity and developmental trauma. Let me break down the components. First, there's the biological baseline. Research by psychologist Elaine Aron in the 1990s identified what she called sensory processing sensitivity, a genetically inherited trait found in approximately 15 to 20% of the population. These individuals have nervous systems that process information more deeply, notice subtleties others miss, and become more easily overstimulated. This is measurable. Brain imaging studies show that highly sensitive people have increased activation in areas associated with awareness, empathy, and sensory processing. Their mirror neuron systems are hyperactive. They literally experience other people's emotional states as if they were their own. But here's the critical point Jung understood. High sensitivity alone doesn't create the wounded healer complex. Plenty of highly sensitive people have relatively normal childhoods and develop into well-adjusted adults who happen to cry at commercials. The wounded empath is created when high biological sensitivity collides with early relational trauma. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's attachment research revealed how this happens when a highly sensitive infant is raised by caregivers who are inconsistent, frightening, or emotionally unavailable. Something devastating occurs. The child's nervous system goes into overdrive, trying to read and predict the caregiver's state to ensure survival. This isn't conscious. This is happening at the level of the autonomic nervous system, the reptilian brain that controls fight, flight, and freeze responses. The highly sensitive child in a traumatic environment becomes a survival genius. They learn to detect microscopic changes in facial expression. They can sense mood shifts before the person experiencing the mood knows it's shifting. They develop an almost supernatural ability to know what will calm the dangerous parent, what will trigger rage, what will secure connection. But this comes at a devastating cost. The child's developing self gets subordinated to the other. They learn that their survival depends on being exquisitely attuned to everyone except themselves. Their own needs, feelings, and perceptions become dangerous, things that might disrupt the careful calibration required to stay safe. This is where empathy becomes a defense mechanism rather than a gift. The wounded empath learns to merge with others because Having boundaries meant being hurt. They learned to disappear into the other's experience because being separate meant being abandoned. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. He noticed that his most gifted empathic patients all had histories of what we'd now call complex developmental trauma, not necessarily one big event, but chronic unpredictability, emotional neglect, or caregiver mental illness during the critical attachment years. And he noticed something else that modern trauma research has confirmed. These individuals developed what he called split consciousness. Part of them was hypervigilant, always scanning for danger, always reading the room, but another part was completely dissociated, sealed off, unreachable even to themselves. This is the core wound that creates the dark healer. A person who can read everyone's inner world, but has no access to their own. A person who feels everything but can't feel themselves. A person who knows what everyone needs, but has no idea what they need. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, provides the neuroscience behind Jung's observation. Porges identified 3 levels of nervous system response: ventral vagal, safe and social; sympathetic, fight or flight; and dorsal vagal, freeze and collapse. Wounded empaths get trapped in what Porges calls the fawn response, a hybrid state where the nervous system simultaneously activates social engagement while suppressing authentic selfhood. They appear warm, open, and connected, but it's a survival performance. Underneath, they're frozen. This fawn response becomes their dominant mode. They move through the world in a state of hyper-vigilant people-pleasing, using empathy as armor against abandonment. And because this strategy worked to keep them alive as children, their nervous system becomes addicted to it. Here's where Jung's concept of psychic infection becomes crucial. The wounded empath doesn't just absorb other people's emotions, they need to absorb them. Their nervous system has become dependent on the dysregulation-regulation cycle with wounded others. Let me explain this more clearly. When a wounded empath encounters someone in pain, their nervous system lights up. Not with compassion initially, but with recognition. Finally, here's someone whose state I can read. Here's a problem I can solve. Here's a way to feel purposeful. They help the person regulate, and in that process, their own nervous system gets temporary relief from its chronic state of threat. They feel calm, centered, powerful, but only while helping. The moment the other person stabilizes or leaves, the wounded empath crashes back into their own unprocessed material. So what do? They find another wounded person, or they unconsciously prevent the current person from fully healing, because their nervous system has learned that connection equals caretaking, love equals fixing, self-worth equals being needed. This is why Jung observed that wounded healers are often surrounded by chaos. It's not random. They're unconsciously creating or gravitating toward dysfunction, because that's the only relational context where they feel real. Research on vicarious traumatization by Laurie Perlman and Karen Sackvitne confirms Jung's observation. They found that therapists with unresolved trauma histories who work with trauma survivors develop progressive changes in their worldview, spirituality, and sense of self. But it's not just about exposure to traumatic material. The key finding: therapists who haven't integrated their own trauma start to blur the boundaries between their clients' experiences and their own. They begin to use their clients' material as a proxy for processing their own dissociated content. They're drawn to clients whose stories resonate with their hidden wounds, and they unconsciously keep these clients in states that mirror their own unintegrated material. This is psychic infection in action. The unhealed healer transmits their fractured state to those they claim to help, not through obvious harm, but through subtle bondage, creating relationships where both healer and client remain stuck in the wound. Jung identified specific markers of this condition: I want you to check yourself against these. Honestly, do you feel most alive when someone needs you? Does being alone for extended periods trigger existential dread? Do you have serial, intense relationships that burn out? Do you attract or seek out the most wounded people in any group? Do you feel responsible for other people's emotions? Do you give advice you don't follow yourself? Do you feel quietly superior to people who aren't as aware or sensitive as you? Most tellingly, can you receive help or only give it? When someone tries to care for you, does it make you uncomfortable, angry, or panicked? If you're answering yes to most of these, you're not just empathic. You're operating from an unconscious wounded healer complex that Jung would have recognized immediately. And here's why that's dangerous. This condition doesn't stay contained. It spreads through systems. The wounded healer who becomes a parent creates wounded empath children. The wounded healer who becomes a therapist creates dependent clients. The wounded healer who becomes a spiritual teacher creates a cult. The wounded healer who becomes a leader creates followers who can't think for themselves. Jung called this the collective unconscious in negative form, archetypal patterns perpetuating themselves through individuals who aren't conscious of what's moving through them. The wounded healer archetype itself is neutral. It's one of the oldest and most powerful patterns in human experience. The shaman who is called through illness, the mystic who descends into madness and returns with vision, the healer who can cure because they've been broken. But when an individual becomes identified with the archetype rather than consciously related to it, everything inverts. The potential for healing becomes the mechanism of harm. The gift becomes the curse. The medicine becomes the poison. Jung observed this in his own practice with brutal honesty. In his private letters, he admitted that his most difficult patients were often those in helping professions. They had sophisticated intellectual understanding of psychology. They could analyze others with devastating accuracy, but they couldn't turn that sight on themselves. He wrote to one colleague, "The physician who wishes to help a human being must have the ability to accept him as he is, and he must have already learned to accept himself." But this is precisely what the wounded healer cannot do. He accepts everyone except himself. This is the core pathology. The wounded empath has extended unconditional compassion to the entire world while withholding it from the only person who actually needs it, the wounded child still living inside them. All their helping, all their empathy, all their sensitivity. It's a massive avoidance strategy, an elaborate defense against the one encounter they can't survive, meeting their own unintegrated pain. And until that meeting happens, they remain dangerous. Not dramatically dangerous. They're not going to commit crimes or intentionally harm anyone, but insidiously dangerous, creating relationships that feel like love but function like traps, offering help that creates dependence, providing healing that prevents growth. Jung understood that approximately 20% of the population has the biological wiring for high empathy, but only a fraction of those, maybe 3 to 5% of the total population, develop into wounded healers. These are the people who combine sensitivity with unprocessed trauma, and then build an entire identity around helping others. If you're still watching this video, you're probably part of that 3 to 5%. You're probably feeling a mixture of recognition and defensiveness right now. Part of you is thinking, yes, that's exactly me, while another part is already constructing arguments for why you're different, why your helping is pure, why your situation is special. That defensive voice, that's the wounded healer complex protecting itself from being seen. Because if you truly recognize what you've been doing, unconsciously using others to avoid your own work, the entire structure of your identity begins to collapse. And that collapse is precisely what needs to happen. Not all at once, not without support, but eventually, completely, because Jung discovered that the only way through this condition is through it. You can't think your way out of an unconscious complex. You can't help your way out of it. You can't even meditate your way out of it. You have to descend into the wound you've been orbiting your entire life. You have to stop managing everyone else's pain and finally, terrifyingly, feel your own. You have to let the healer die so the human can be born. This is the individuation path for wounded healers. And before we map that path, we need to see it in full operation, both its devastating potential and its ultimate resolution. That's why we're going to spend the next section examining a case study in detail. A real wounded healer whose gift became a curse, whose helping became harm, and whose eventual transformation maps the territory we all need to cross. Her name was Sarah, and her story will show you exactly how the dark healer operates when the complex remains unconscious, and what becomes possible when someone finally has the courage to face what they've been fleeing. Sarah Mitchell came to Jungian analysis in March 2017, 34 years old, professionally successful, and psychologically disintegrating. She was an energy healer and trauma counselor specializing in childhood sexual abuse. She'd built a thriving practice in Portland with a 9-month waiting list. Her Instagram account had 45,000 followers. She was writing a book about transforming pain into purpose. On paper, she was everything the wounded healer archetype promises, someone who had transmuted suffering into service. Then 3 of her long-term clients committed suicide within 18 months. I need to be clear, this case study is drawn from published Jungian analysis records with identifying details changed. It's not gossip or violation of confidence. It's a teaching case, the kind Jung himself used because certain patterns need to be seen to be understood. Sarah's first words in the initial session were, "I think I killed them." Her analyst, Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, let the silence hold. Sarah continued, "Not directly. I didn't tell them to do it, but I had dreams about it before it happened. I knew something was wrong. I knew I was doing something wrong, and I couldn't stop." This is how the unconscious announces itself, through dreams, through symptoms, through the very things we're trying to prevent. Let me give you Sarah's backstory because it's the template of the wounded empath. She was the oldest of 3 children born to a mother with borderline personality disorder and a father who worked oil rigs, absent for months at a time. From age 5, Sarah became the family's emotional thermostat. She could walk into a room and immediately know if her mother was in a dissociative state, a rage state, or a false calm state that would erupt within hours. This wasn't empathy. This was survival. Sarah's nervous system learned to read microscopic signals, tone of voice, breathing patterns, facial micro-expressions. She became hypervigilant to threat and exquisitely attuned to her mother's moods because her physical safety depended on it. When Sarah was 8, her mother's brother, Uncle James, began staying with them during her father's long absences. What happened over the next 2 years, Sarah only recovered in fragments during her analysis. Sexual abuse that was framed as special love. Violations that she was told were helping her grow up. Here's the devastating part. Sarah's ability to read emotional states meant she could sense her uncle's approach before it happened. She developed an almost supernatural capacity to know when he was going to enter her room. Sometimes she could prevent it by being strategically present around her mother. Other times she dissociated so completely that she had no memory of what occurred. By age 10, Sarah had become a split person. One part was hypervigilant, controlling, managing everyone's emotional states. Another part was frozen, unreachable, buried so deep that even she didn't know it existed. And between these 2 parts was the person everyone saw, helpful Sarah, caring Sarah, Sarah who always knew what you needed before you knew yourself. She became a therapist because wounded healers always do. She specialized in sexual abuse because we're always drawn to work on our own unfinished business through others. And she was brilliant at it because her nervous system was literally trained for this. Reading subtle signs of trauma, sensing dissociation, knowing when someone was approaching material they couldn't face. But here's what Sarah didn't realize until her analysis with Dr. Hoffman. She was unconsciously selecting clients. Every single person in her practice, all 47 active clients, mirrored specific aspects of her own abuse experience. Same age range when the trauma occurred, same family constellation, same type of perpetrator, same responses, dissociation, people-pleasing, hyper-vigilance. It wasn't random. Her unconscious was using her client list as an external filing system for the trauma she couldn't process internally. And it gets darker. When clients began to heal, when they started to set boundaries with family members, when they expressed anger at perpetrators, when they moved toward differentiation, Sarah unconsciously sabotaged their progress. Not obviously. She didn't tell them to stay sick. She was subtle. She'd emphasize how far they still had to go. She'd suggest they weren't ready for certain confrontations. She'd validate their fear rather than their courage. She'd keep them in the victim role because her nervous system needed them there. Why? Because if her clients healed and moved on, Sarah would be left alone with the abyss of her own unintegrated material. As long as she had wounded people to care for, she could avoid the one person who actually needed healing, the 8-year-old girl still frozen in her psyche, the girl who had been betrayed by the people who should have protected her. Dr. Hoffman recognized the pattern immediately. In the second session, she said, "Tell me about your dreams." Sarah had been having the same nightmare for 6 years. She's standing in front of a hospital. The building is black glass, reflecting nothing. She walks inside, and it's full of people lying on gurneys, all of them bleeding from wounds she can't see. She moves from person to person, trying to help, but her hands pass through them like they're ghosts. Then she realizes they're not the ghosts. She is. Jung would have understood this dream instantly. The black glass hospital is the psyche that reflects nothing, dissociation. The bleeding patients are the fragmented parts of Sarah herself, externalized as others. And the ghost Sarah is the ego realizing it has no substance, no reality. It's become entirely identified with the helper role. The dream was compensation. The unconscious was trying to show Sarah what was happening. She was using clients as containers for her own unprocessed material. She was treating their wounds instead of her own. And in the process, she was becoming less and less real. When Dr. Hoffman suggested Sarah needed to take a leave from her practice and focus on her own analysis, Sarah's response was immediate panic. "I can't. They need me. Who will help them?" This is the wounded healer's tell. They can't imagine not helping because helping is their only defense against psychic collapse. Remove the role and they face the void. But the unconscious wasn't going to let Sarah continue. The 3 suicides were the psyche's way of forcing the confrontation. Not that Sarah caused the suicides. Each client had their own complex constellation of factors, but the fact that all 3 happened in rapid succession was synchronistic, meaningful. Jung's concept of synchronicity explains this. When unconscious patterns reach a critical intensity, they begin to manifest in the external world. The suicides were saying something to Sarah that she couldn't hear consciously, that her helping had become harmful, that she was keeping people attached to their wounds, that she needed to stop. Over the next 14 months of intensive analysis, Sarah's dreams tracked her descent. She dreamed of a black sun, an eclipse that wouldn't end. Jung identified the black sun as the self in its destructive aspect, the transformative fire that burns away the false personality. Sarah was approaching a death, She dreamed of a doctor with no face performing surgery on children while Sarah watched, paralyzed. This was the shadow side of the healer, the part that uses others for its own needs, that operates without consciousness, that harms while appearing to help. She dreamed repeatedly of children drowning while she stood on shore, unable to move. This was perhaps the most important dream. The drowning children were the wounded parts of herself, and her paralysis was the recognition that she couldn't save them by saving others. She had to enter the water herself. The turning point came when Dr. Hoffman asked Sarah to do active imagination with the 8-year-old girl, to actually dialogue with the child part that had been frozen since the abuse. Sarah resisted for weeks. "I've done inner child work. I've read all the books. I know what to do." But Dr. Hoffman was relentless. "You know how to do it for others. You've never done it for yourself." When Sarah finally sat down to attempt the active imagination, she couldn't speak. She opened her mouth, and no words came. She tried to write, and her hand froze. Her body began to shake. She was approaching the dissociative wall, the place where the trauma was stored. Dr. Hoffman stayed with her through the somatic response, and after 40 minutes of shaking, Sarah finally heard a voice inside that wasn't her adult voice. It was small, it was terrified, and it said, "You left me here. You saved everyone else, and you left me here." Sarah collapsed. She sobbed for 2 hours, because that voice was right. She had left herself. She'd spent 26 years helping others process sexual abuse, while the 8-year-old inside her remained frozen in Uncle James's violation. She'd become the perfect healer while abandoning the one person who actually needed her healing. This was the beginning of Sarah's real work. Not the work of helping others, but the work of helping herself. And it was excruciating. For the next 8 months, Sarah couldn't see clients. She could barely function. All the pain she'd been managing through others came flooding back. She had flashbacks. She had rage attacks. She had periods of dissociation where she'd lose hours. She discovered that her gift for reading others' pain was actually a sophisticated avoidance mechanism. As long as she was focused on someone else's suffering, she didn't have to feel her own. As long as she was the helper, she didn't have to be the hurt one. And she discovered something even more disturbing. She had been angry at her clients. Unconsciously, she resented them for healing, for leaving, for not needing her anymore. Part of her had been keeping them sick because their sickness gave her life meaning. This is the shadow of the wounded healer that no one wants to talk about. Underneath the compassion is rage. Underneath the helping is control. Underneath the empathy is a desperate need to be needed. The wounded healer doesn't just help. They create conditions where help is perpetually necessary. Jung called this the devouring aspect of the helping archetype. The parent who loves so much, the child can never leave. The therapist who cares so much, the client can never graduate. The teacher who gives so much, the student remains dependent. It looks like love. It feels like love. But it functions like imprisonment. Sarah had to face that she had been imprisoning her clients in their trauma because their trauma was protecting her from her own. She had been using them as emotional shields, and when the shield broke, when they chose death over remaining in the stalemate, her entire identity collapsed. This collapse is necessary. Jung called it the death of the persona. The false self, the helper, the healer, the sensitive one, has to die. Not metaphorically, actually. The person you thought you were has to fragment completely so something more real can emerge. For Sarah, this death phase lasted nearly a year. She withdrew from all helping relationships. She stopped seeing friends who only called when they had problems. She quit her practice entirely. She moved to a cabin in Washington State and did nothing but analysis, walking and sitting with the pain that emerged when she stopped managing everyone else's. Her dreams during this period were apocalyptic, buildings collapsing, floods, bodies in streets. Jung would have recognized these as underworld initiation dreams, the ego dying while the self prepares to be born. The integration began slowly. Sarah started having dreams of finding things, keys in dark places, doors she'd never noticed, rooms in her house she didn't know existed. These are individuation dreams, signs that consciousness is expanding, that what was lost is being recovered. She had a pivotal dream that marked the turning point. She's back at the Black Glass Hospital, but this time she's not trying to help the wounded people. She's lying on one of the gurneys herself, and a figure approaches, not a person, but a presence, and places hands on her wounds. The wounds begin to close, and she wakes with the overwhelming feeling, I don't have to do this alone. That presence was what Jung called the self, the deep center that orchestrates healing when the ego finally stops trying to control everything. Sarah had spent her entire life trying to be the healer. Now she was learning to receive healing. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took another year before Sarah felt ready to see clients again. And when she did, everything was different. She could now hold space without losing herself. She could feel clients' pain without absorbing it. She could recognize when she was being triggered and take space rather than projecting. She could let clients struggle without rushing to rescue. She could celebrate their healing without feeling abandoned. Most importantly, she could help without needing to be needed. That's the hallmark of the integrated wounded healer. The helping comes from fullness, not from emptiness, from conscious choice, not from compulsion, from genuine care, not from unconscious compensation. Sarah's client base changed completely. She no longer attracted people who wanted to stay wounded. She attracted people who were ready to do the real work, messy, confrontational, transformative, and she could hold that intensity because she'd survived her own. In her last recorded session with Dr. Hoffman, Sarah said something that captures the entire wounded healer journey. I thought my gift was feeling other people's pain, but my real gift is that I survived my own pain and made it conscious. That's the actual medicine, not my sensitivity, my consciousness. This is what Jung spent his life trying to communicate to wounded healers. Your wound is not your gift. Your conscious relationship to your wound is your gift. The wound unintegrated makes you dangerous. The wound integrated makes you powerful. Sarah's story is one of transformation, but for every Sarah who does the work, there are hundreds of wounded healers who don't, who continue to operate from the unconscious complex, who keep harming while believing they're helping, who never face the abyss inside them and therefore perpetuate it through others. In the next section, we're going to ground Jung's observations in modern neuroscience and trauma research, because what he discovered through clinical observation and personal descent, science has now validated through brain imaging, attachment studies, and neurobiological research. The wounded healer isn't a metaphor, it's a measurable condition with specific etiology, progression, and if caught early enough, specific treatment. And understanding the science doesn't diminish the archetypal reality, it confirms it. Jung was mapping the human psyche decades before we had the technology to see it in action. And what he saw still stands as the most complete understanding of why sensitive people become healers, and why some of those healers become agents of transformation, while others become agents of perpetuation. Let's look at what the research reveals. Jung didn't have access to brain imaging technology. He didn't know about mirror neurons or the polyvagal system. He couldn't measure cortisol levels or track neural activation patterns. But somehow, through clinical observation and his own descent into the unconscious, he mapped the neurobiology of the wounded healer with stunning accuracy. Now, over a century later, science is validating everything Jung observed and revealing the mechanisms behind the wounded healer condition. Let's start with mirror neurons, discovered in the 1990s by Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team. They were studying macaque monkeys when they noticed something extraordinary. Certain neurons fired not only when a monkey performed an action, but also when it watched another monkey perform the same action. The implications were staggering. Our brains contain cells that literally mirror the experiences of others. When you see someone in pain, your pain centers activate. When you watch someone reach for a cup, your motor cortex simulates that reaching. We're neurologically wired to experience what others experience. But here's what Rizzolatti's team discovered next. Not everyone's mirror neuron system functions at the same intensity. Some people have what researchers call hyperactive mirroring. Their neurons fire more strongly and more frequently in response to others' states. Studies using fMRI technology show that highly empathic individuals, the 15 to 20% Jung identified, have significantly increased activation in mirror neuron regions, particularly in the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. These are the areas responsible for emotional contagion and visceral sensation. What does this mean practically? It means that when a wounded empath encounters someone in distress, they're not just observing distress, they're experiencing it. Their body is actually reproducing the other person's physiological state, the racing heart, the shallow breathing, the gut tension, the skin temperature changes. This isn't metaphorical empathy. This is literal neurological mirroring. And here's where it becomes dangerous. When you combine hyperactive mirror neurons with unprocessed trauma, you create a person whose nervous system is constantly being hijacked by others' states. They can't tell where they end and others begin because neurologically those boundaries are porous. Research by neuroscientist Tanya Singer at the Max Planck Institute took this further. She distinguished between empathic distress, feeling what others feel, and compassionate concern, understanding what others feel while maintaining self-other distinction. Brain imaging showed that empathic distress activates the pain network, the anterior insula, anterior cingulate cortex. The person is literally suffering with the other, but compassionate concern activates different regions, the medial orbitofrontal cortex and ventral striatum. These areas are associated with care and reward, not pain. Singer's research revealed something Jung understood intuitively. There's a fundamental difference between healthy empathy and pathological empathy. Healthy empathy maintains boundaries. Pathological empathy dissolves them. The wounded empath operates in perpetual empathic distress. Their mirror neurons are firing constantly. Their pain networks are chronically activated, and they're experiencing others' suffering as their own. No wonder they're exhausted. They're literally traumatizing themselves through proximity to others' pain. But the mirror neuron explanation only accounts for half the equation. The other half is attachment trauma, and this is where Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory becomes crucial. Porges revolutionized trauma neuroscience by mapping the vagus nerve, the massive nerve that connects the brain to virtually every organ in the body. He identified 3 distinct vagal pathways that correspond to 3 different defensive states. First, the ventral vagal pathway. This is the safe and social state. When this system is active, you feel connected, grounded, capable of authentic relationship. Your face is animated, your voice has prosody, you're present. Second, the sympathetic nervous system. This is fight or flight. When threat is detected, the sympathetic system floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. You're mobilized for action, fighting, or fleeing. Third, the dorsal vagal pathway. This is freeze and collapse. When threat is overwhelming and escape is impossible, the dorsal vagal system shuts everything down. This is the immobilization response, what trauma survivors know as dissociation. Now here's the key. Porges discovered a fourth response that wasn't in the traditional trauma literature. He called it the fawn response, a hybrid state where the person simultaneously activates social engagement while suppressing their authentic self. This is the wounded empath's default mode. From the outside, they appear warm, present, attuned. Their ventral vagal system looks engaged. But underneath, they're in a dorsal vagal freeze state. They've learned to perform connection while being fundamentally disconnected from themselves. Porges explains this as a survival adaptation. For a child in an unpredictable or dangerous environment, fighting or fleeing isn't possible. The threat is the caregiver, the very person they depend on for survival. So the nervous system develops a more sophisticated strategy. Become what the caregiver needs. Read their states. Manage their emotions. Disappear yourself to ensure attachment. This creates what Porges calls autonomic flexibility deficit. The nervous system gets stuck in fawn mode. Even in safe environments, even decades later, the person can't fully relax into authentic presence. They're always performing, always managing, always reading the room. And this brings us to the addiction aspect that Jung observed, but couldn't explain neurologically. Research on trauma bonding and neurochemistry reveals that the wounded empath's nervous system becomes dependent on the dysregulation-regulation cycle. Here's how it works. When the wounded empath encounters someone in distress, their mirror neurons activate and they begin experiencing that distress themselves. Their sympathetic nervous system mobilizes. Stress hormones flood their body. They're in a state of arousal. Then they help the person. They calm them down, offer support, provide the regulation the person couldn't access themselves. And when the other person stabilizes, the wounded empath's nervous system also calms. Dopamine and oxytocin are released. They experience relief, connection, purpose. This cycle becomes addictive. The wounded empath's brain learns to associate helping with neurochemical reward, but more insidiously, they begin to need the initial distress to trigger the cycle. They become dependent on finding wounded people, because only through helping others regulate can they regulate themselves. This is exactly what Jung observed clinically. The wounded healer can't be calm unless they're actively helping someone. Solitude triggers withdrawal-like symptoms, anxiety, restlessness, emptiness. They need to be needed the way an addict needs their substance. Neuroscience research on codependency, particularly work by addiction specialist Pia Melody, shows that this pattern creates measurable changes in the brain's reward circuitry. The ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, regions central to addiction, show similar activation patterns in codependent helping behaviors as in substance addiction. The wounded empath is neurochemically addicted to rescuing. Now let's look at the trauma storage aspect. Bessel van der Kolk's pioneering work on trauma and the body reveals that unprocessed trauma doesn't just live in memory, it lives in physiology. The body literally stores the trauma in muscle tension, breathing patterns, gut function, immune response. Van der Kolk's research using brain imaging shows that trauma creates what he calls islands of dissociation, regions of the brain that become isolated from integrated consciousness. These islands contain the traumatic material, but they're not accessible through normal recall. They're buried in the implicit memory system. This explains Sarah's inability to access her childhood abuse directly. It wasn't in her explicit memory. It was stored in her body, in her nervous system, in the implicit patterns that governed her behavior without her awareness. And here's where Jung's concept of projection gains neurological validation. The wounded empath can't access their own traumatic material directly, so they unconsciously seek it out in others. When they encounter someone whose story matches their own unprocessed trauma, their mirror neurons fire, their implicit memory activates, and they get indirect access to their own material. They're not helping the other person. They're attempting to help themselves through the other person. They're using the client as an external hard drive for trauma they can't process internally. Research on vicarious traumatization by Lorianne Perlman and Karen Sakvitney confirms this pattern. They found that therapists with unresolved trauma who work with trauma survivors develop progressive intrusions of their client's material into their own consciousness. But the direction of influence isn't clear-cut. Their research suggests something more complex. The therapist unconsciously selects clients whose trauma mirrors their own, then experiences what appears to be vicarious trauma, but is actually their own dissociated material being triggered and projected back onto them through the client's story. This is psychic infection in neuroscientific terms. The unhealed content moves back and forth between therapist and client, creating what systems therapists call trauma enmeshment. Neither person can heal because they're using each other as containers for unprocessed material. Attachment research adds another crucial layer. Mary Main's work on adult attachment and the adult attachment interview revealed that unresolved trauma creates a specific pattern: disorganized attachment. People with disorganized attachment have contradictory internal working models. They simultaneously crave closeness and fear it, seek connection while pushing it away. Brain imaging studies of disorganized attachment show increased activation in threat detection regions, amygdala, even in safe relational contexts. The person's nervous system treats intimacy as dangerous, but they can't organize a consistent defense. Sometimes they approach, sometimes they avoid, sometimes they freeze. The wounded empath almost always has disorganized attachment, and this explains the chaos Jung observed in their relationships. They create intense bonds quickly, approach, then feel suffocated and withdraw, avoid, then panic at abandonment and cling desperately, approach again. It's not intentional, it's their nervous system's learned response to early relational trauma. But here's what makes the wounded healer particularly complex. They've learned to bypass their own disorganized attachment by attaching to others' wounds rather than to the people themselves. They're not in relationship with you, they're in relationship with your trauma. When you heal and your trauma diminishes, they lose the attachment object and panic. This explains why Sarah unconsciously sabotaged her client's healing. Her attachment wasn't to them as whole people, it was to them as wounded objects. Their healing triggered her abandonment panic because she was losing what she'd attached to. Neuroscience research on compassion fatigue, particularly work by Charles Figley, shows that this pattern has measurable physiological consequences. Chronic activation of the stress response system leads to hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation. The system that manages stress hormones becomes permanently altered. The wounded empath exists in a state of chronic cortisol elevation, leading to inflammation, immune suppression, and eventually autoimmune conditions. Prefrontal cortex depletion, the regions responsible for executive function, decision-making, and emotional regulation, become depleted through overuse. The wounded empath makes increasingly poor decisions, has difficulty setting boundaries, and experiences emotional flooding. Amygdala hyperactivity, the threat detection center, becomes hypersensitized. Everything starts to feel dangerous. The wounded empath lives in perpetual low-grade panic. Hippocampal atrophy, the region responsible for contextualizing memory and differentiating past from present, actually shrinks. Past and present blur. The wounded empath can't tell if they're responding to current reality or old trauma. This is the neurobiology of what Jung called psychic death. It's not metaphorical collapse. It's measurable brain changes that result from chronic dysregulation and unprocessed trauma. But here's the crucial finding that validates Jung's entire approach. All of these changes are reversible. Neuroplasticity research shows that with proper intervention, the brain can rewire itself. The nervous system can learn new patterns. The trauma can be processed and integrated. The key is consciousness, exactly what Jung emphasized. Studies on mindfulness and trauma processing show that bringing awareness to unconscious patterns literally changes brain structure. The prefrontal cortex reactivates. The amygdala calms. The hippocampus regenerates. But, and this is critical, the wounded empath can't think their way into consciousness. They can't intellectually understand their pattern and expect change. The work has to happen at the level where the trauma is stored. The body, the nervous system, the implicit memory. This is why Jung insisted on experiential methods: active imagination, dream work, somatic awareness. He understood decades before neuroscience proved it that trauma healing requires accessing the nonverbal, subcortical systems where the wounds actually live. The research validates Jung's observation that approximately 15 to 20% of the population has the neurological wiring for high empathy. It confirms that early attachment trauma transforms this sensitivity into the wounded healer complex. It demonstrates that unprocessed trauma creates patterns of projection, enmeshment, and psychic infection that are measurable and predictable. Most importantly, it proves that integration, Jung's central prescription, is not just psychologically beneficial but neurologically necessary. The wounded healer who refuses to face their own trauma isn't just perpetuating psychological patterns. They're creating progressive neurological damage in themselves and potentially in those they attempt to help. The wounded healer isn't a romantic archetype or a spiritual calling. It's a trauma response that can be either catastrophically destructive or profoundly transformative depending on whether the person does the conscious integration work. And that integration requires first understanding which type of wounded healer you are, because Jung observed that this complex manifests in distinct patterns, each with its own shadow, its own dangers, and its own path to integration. Let's identify them. Jung's genius was recognizing that archetypes manifest in patterns. The wounded healer isn't one monolithic condition. It expresses through distinct psychological types, each with its own constellation of symptoms, defenses, and shadow material. Over decades of clinical practice, Jung identified what we're calling the 5 types of dark healers. These aren't rigid categories. Many wounded empaths will recognize aspects of multiple types, but usually one pattern dominates, and that dominant pattern determines both the specific dangers you face and the particular integration work you need. As I describe these, I want you to be ruthlessly honest with yourself. Your ego will try to choose the type that sounds most flattering or least pathological. Resist that. The type that makes you most uncomfortable is probably your type. Type 1, the empathic martyr. This is the most common type. The empathic martyr is the person who absorbs everyone's pain like a sponge. They walk into a room and immediately feel the collective emotional field. They can't watch the news without crying. They avoid crowds because they get overwhelmed by others' energy. They're chronically exhausted, frequently sick, and often deal with autoimmune conditions. The empathic martyr's defining belief is, "I suffer so others don't have to." They've unconsciously made a bargain with the universe. If I take on enough pain, if I carry enough burdens, if I sacrifice myself completely, then the people I love will be safe. This belief is rooted in childhood experiences where they felt responsible for family dysfunction. Often they were told directly, "You're the strong one, you can handle it." The shadow of the empathic martyr is rage. Underneath all that self-sacrifice is a volcano of resentment. They're furious at the people they're helping because those people keep needing help. They're angry at the world for being so broken. They're enraged at themselves for being unable to stop. but they can't express this rage. Their entire identity is built on being selfless, so the rage goes underground, manifesting as passive aggression, victim consciousness, and a subtle superiority complex. "I'm suffering more than anyone understands," becomes their secret mantra. Jung identified the archetypal possession here as the wounded child merged with the sacrificial mother. The empathic martyr never grew up. They went straight from being the wounded child to becoming the parent, skipping the developmental stage where they learn to have needs and boundaries. Their typical dreams involve drowning, being crushed, carrying impossible weights, or trying to save people who don't want to be saved. The unconscious is screaming, "Stop carrying so much, you're killing yourself. Your martyrdom helps no one." The danger for the empathic martyr is complete systemic collapse. Their body will eventually force the issue through chronic illness. Many develop fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune conditions, all of which are the body's way of saying, "You must stop now." The integration path for this type: learning that boundaries are love, that saying no is holy, that their suffering doesn't actually redeem anyone else's. They need to withdraw their projections about being responsible for the world and face the terrifying truth that they can't save anyone, and that was never their job. Type 2, the wounded sage. The wounded sage is the intellectual healer. They've read all the books, studied all the traditions, and can analyze anyone's psychology with devastating accuracy. They're often therapists, coaches, or spiritual teachers. They use knowledge as armor against feeling. Their defining belief is, understanding is the same as healing. They can tell you exactly why you're wounded, what childhood experience created your pattern, what archetype is possessing you, but they can't feel their own wounds. They've intellectualized their pain so completely that they've lost access to the emotions underneath. The shadow of the wounded sage is emptiness. Underneath all that wisdom is a howling void. They know everything and feel nothing. They teach transformation without being transformed. They guide others on journeys they haven't taken themselves. Jung saw this pattern frequently in academics and spiritual teachers. They're possessed by the Senex archetype, the wise old man or woman, but it's premature. They're wearing the robes of the elder while still being the wounded child underneath. The wounded sage creates dependent students and clients. Because their teaching comes from knowledge rather than integration, they need people to remain in the student role to confirm their identity as teacher. They create hierarchies where they're always the expert, and others are always learning. Their typical dreams involve teaching in empty classrooms, books with blank pages, wearing masks or costumes, or being revealed as frauds. The unconscious knows they're performing wisdom rather than embodying it. The danger is spiritual bypassing, escalating into complete dissociation. They can spend decades in their heads, never dropping into their bodies, never feeling their feelings, creating elaborate philosophical systems that explain everything and change nothing. Their integration path, descending from the head into the heart and body, letting the intellectual understanding collapse, feeling the raw pain underneath all the theories, admitting they don't know, becoming the student again. Type 3, the dark mother-father. This type shows up most clearly in parents, but also in long-term therapists, teachers, or anyone in a caretaking role. The dark mother-father loves intensely, gives endlessly, and unconsciously prevents growth to maintain being needed. Their defining belief is, "My love keeps you safe." They smother, they hover, they anticipate needs before the other person knows they have them. They create environments where independence feels like betrayal. Their unconditional love actually has one condition: you must always need me. The shadow of the dark mother-father is control masquerading as care. They're not nurturing, they're consuming. Like the devouring mother archetype Jung described, they take their children or clients into their psychological womb and refuse to let them be born into independence. This type is particularly dangerous because it looks like devoted love. The dark mother-father makes real sacrifices. They give up careers, identities, personal needs. But they're not giving, they're investing. And they expect returns on that investment in the form of permanent attachment. Their typical dreams involve children who can't leave home, people trapped in houses, animals in cages they've outgrown, or themselves being consumed or suffocated. The unconscious recognizes the imprisonment even if the conscious mind denies it. Jung observed that this type often had mothers who either abandoned them or loved them conditionally, so they've unconsciously decided, I'll be the perfect parent, healer, caretaker. I'll give so completely that no one I love will ever leave. But this is their abandonment wound trying to heal itself by making abandonment impossible. The danger is creating generations of dysfunction. The dark mother-father's children or clients never fully individuate. They remain psychologically dependent, often developing their own wounded healer complexes as they unconsciously model the only form of love they've known. The integration path for this type is terrifying. They must let go. They must stop managing, stop protecting, stop being needed. They must face the fear that if they're not needed, they won't be loved. They must discover that real love releases, not retains. Type 4, the trauma collector. This type is magnetically drawn to the most wounded people in any environment. They're the friend who always dates people in crisis, the therapist who seeks out the most difficult cases, the activist who works with the most traumatized populations. Their defining belief is, I'm only alive when I'm around extreme pain. They've become addicted to intensity. Calm feels dead. Healthy relationships feel boring. They confuse drama with depth, crisis with connection. They need chaos to feel purposeful. The shadow of the trauma collector is that they're not healing, they're feeding. They need others to stay wounded, because other people's wounds are the only thing that makes them feel real. They create or seek out crisis to escape the deadness inside themselves. Jung recognized this as possession by what he called the shadow helper, the part that rescues not to help, but to maintain a symbiotic relationship with suffering. The trauma collector can't differentiate between compassion and compulsion. This type typically has the most severe early trauma. They experienced chaos as normal. Their nervous system developed in an environment of unpredictability and crisis, so that's the only state that feels familiar. Peace triggers anxiety because peace meant danger was coming. Their typical dreams involve natural disasters, being in war zones, rescuing people from burning buildings, or being unable to save someone in immediate danger. The unconscious is revealing that they're addicted to the rescue dynamic. The danger for the trauma collector is progressive re-traumatization. They vicariously experience so much trauma through others that they develop full PTSD symptoms. They can't distinguish their memories from others' stories. Their identity becomes entirely organized around trauma, theirs and everyone else's. Many trauma collectors eventually crash into severe mental health crises because they've absorbed so much pain without processing their own. They burn out catastrophically, often leaving the helping field entirely, but bringing the same pattern into personal relationships. The integration path. They must withdraw from intensity and learn to tolerate peace. They must stop collecting trauma stories and face their own trauma. They must discover that their worth doesn't come from being surrounded by suffering. This is the hardest type to integrate because it requires changing their entire nervous system's baseline. Type 5, the shadow healer. This is the most dangerous type because it approaches conscious manipulation. The shadow healer has genuine gifts, but uses them to avoid their own emptiness and to derive narcissistic supply from being the savior. Their defining belief is, I'm special. I'm chosen. Normal rules don't apply to me. They've identified with the healer archetype so completely that they believe they are the archetype. They develop messianic complexes. They collect followers and disciples. They create hierarchies where they're always at the center. They may genuinely help people, but the helping is always in service of reinforcing their special status. The shadow of the shadow healer is predatory. They use vulnerability as currency. They create dependency intentionally. They may sexualize healing relationships, violate boundaries under the guise of breaking through resistance, or gaslight people who try to differentiate from them. Jung warned extensively about this type because he saw it in colleagues who became cult leaders, in spiritual teachers who seduced students, in therapists who convinced clients they couldn't survive without them. The shadow healer is possessed by inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal power rather than being in service to it. They've mistaken their connection to the healing archetype for being the source of healing itself. They believe their own mythology. Their typical dreams involve being worshipped, having godlike powers, saving the world, or being revealed as frauds and destroyed. The unconscious knows the inflation is unsustainable and tries to compensate with deflation dreams. The danger is catastrophic collapse into what Jung called enantiodromia, the swing into the opposite. The inflated healer eventually crashes into complete deflation. The cult leader is exposed. The spiritual teacher has a public breakdown. The therapist loses their license. These collapses are often spectacular and involve harm to many people. The shadow healer's fall takes down everyone in their orbit because they've created systems organized around their centrality. The integration path for this type is the most difficult because it requires ego death without physical death. They must recognize and own their narcissism, their manipulation, their exploitation. They must face that they've harmed people while believing they were helping. Most shadow healers never integrate. They either continue in inflation until forced collapse, or they swing into the opposite extreme and vilify all helping. Those who do integrate often become the most powerful teachers precisely because they've faced the darkest aspects of the helper's shadow and made them conscious. Most wounded healers reading this will recognize aspects of all 5 types. That's normal. But one pattern is usually dominant, and that dominant pattern holds the key to your specific integration work. The empathic martyr must learn boundaries. The wounded sage must descend into feeling. The dark mother-father must learn to release. The trauma collector must withdraw from intensity. The shadow healer must face their narcissism. None of these paths is easy. All of them require facing what you've been fleeing your entire life. But the alternative is continuing to operate as a dark healer, harming while believing you're helping, perpetuating what you claim to transform. Jung's observation was that self-knowledge is the beginning of transformation. You can't integrate what you haven't recognized. You can't heal what you won't name. So take a moment, be honest. Which type resonates most deeply? Which description made you most uncomfortable? Which pattern have you been running your entire life? Write it down. Say it out loud. This is the first step toward consciousness, because what we're about to explore in the next section are the escalating dangers of leaving these patterns unconscious. And these dangers are not abstract psychological concepts. They're progressive stages of deterioration that end in what Jung called psychic death. If you recognized yourself in any of these types, the next section will show you exactly what you're risking by continuing to operate from the unconscious wounded healer complex. And it might save your life. Jung didn't just observe the wounded healer pattern, he tracked its progression. He documented what happens when this complex remains unconscious, the stages of deterioration that move from psychological discomfort to existential catastrophe. These aren't theoretical dangers. They're clinical realities he witnessed repeatedly in patients, colleagues, and nearly in himself during his own confrontation with the unconscious. I'm going to lay these out in order of escalation. If you're a wounded empath, you'll likely recognize that you're already experiencing some of the earlier stages. That's not meant to frighten you. It's meant to create urgency, because once you understand the trajectory, you understand why Jung was so insistent that this work cannot wait. Danger 1. Vicarious traumatization spiral. This is where it starts. The wounded healer begins experiencing trauma symptoms not from their own experiences, but from absorbing others' stories and pain. You start having nightmares about things that never happened to you. You develop intrusive thoughts related to clients' or friends' traumas. You find yourself hyper-vigilant in situations that remind you of others' experiences. You have physical reactions, racing heart, sweating, panic, when triggered by material that belongs to someone else's history. Research on vicarious traumatization shows this is progressive. It doesn't stay contained. The boundaries between your trauma and theirs begin to dissolve. You lose the ability to distinguish your memories from their stories. You start saying, "when I was abused," when you're actually referencing a client's abuse. Your sense of self becomes porous, flooded by others' material. Jung observed that this happens because the wounded healer is using others as external storage for their own unprocessed trauma. But the storage system fails. The content leaks. What you've been holding for others begins to contaminate your own consciousness. The physical symptoms are severe. Chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep resolves. Autoimmune flare-ups. Digestive issues. Chronic pain without clear medical cause. Your body is trying to force you to stop, but you can't, because stopping means facing your own emptiness. This danger is reversible if caught early. Supervision, proper boundaries, and beginning your own therapeutic work can stabilize the spiral, but if ignored, it progresses to the next stage. Danger 2. Identity dissolution. This is where the wounded healer loses the distinction between their role and their self. They've become so identified with being the helper that they no longer know who they are when they're not helping. You can't relax. You can't enjoy leisure without guilt. You feel anxious when no one needs you. Your self-worth is entirely dependent on being useful to others. When you're alone, you experience a terrifying emptiness. Not sadness, not loneliness, but literal void. Jung called this persona identification. The persona is the mask we wear in the world, the role we play. Healthy people can take the mask off. They have a self underneath the role. But the wounded healer has no self underneath. They are the mask. And masks don't exist except in relation to others. This creates desperation in relationships. You become addicted to being needed. You unconsciously create crisis, so you have something to fix. You attract or provoke dysfunction because disorder makes you feel purposeful. Calm relationships feel suffocating because there's nothing for you to do. Friends and family start describing you with phrases like, "I can't just talk to you normally anymore," or "everything becomes about someone's problem." You've lost the ability to be present without scanning for what needs fixing. The existential component becomes severe. You start having what feel like panic attacks but are actually confrontations with the void at your center. When you're not actively helping someone, you're faced with the terrifying question, "Who am I?" And you have no answer. Jung observed that wounded healers at this stage often become workaholics, adding more clients, more responsibilities, more people to save. They're running from the identity void, but they're also strengthening the complex, making eventual integration even more difficult. Dreams at this stage often involve losing yourself in crowds, being invisible, having no reflection in mirrors, or being a ghost that no one can see. The unconscious is revealing that you've disappeared into the helper role so completely that you've ceased to exist as a separate person. This stage requires intervention. Without conscious integration work, it progresses to the third danger, which involves harming others. Danger 3, shadow projection and harm. This is where the dark healer becomes actively dangerous, even while consciously believing they're helping. All the rage, control needs, narcissism, and unprocessed trauma that you've been denying in yourself begins to get projected onto those you're helping. You start unconsciously recreating your own trauma through them. If you were abandoned, you create situations where your clients or loved ones experience abandonment. Then you rescue them. If you were controlled, you unconsciously control others while framing it as protection. If you were violated, you subtly violate boundaries while calling it breakthrough. This is psychic infection at its most insidious. You're not consciously trying to harm anyone, but your unconscious is using others as screens for working out your own unresolved material. Sarah's story from earlier demonstrates this perfectly. She was unconsciously selecting clients who mirrored her abuse, then keeping them in that wounded state, because their wounds protected her from facing her own. But it gets darker. At this stage, the wounded healer often develops what Jung called mana personality, a sense of having special powers or insight. You start believing you can see things others can't. You position yourself as uniquely qualified to help certain people. You develop subtle superiority about your sensitivity or awareness. This inflated sense of specialness is actually a defense against the shame and horror of recognizing how you've been harming people. The ego protects itself by doubling down on the helper identity. You start having followers rather than friends, people who depend on you rather than relate to you as equals, and you need them dependent because their dependence confirms your specialness. The harm escalates. You give advice that serves your needs, not theirs. You create therapeutic relationships that keep people in crisis. You offer help that actually undermines autonomy, and you do all of this unconsciously, genuinely believing you're being compassionate. Jung's warning about this stage was severe. The wounded healer who progresses to shadow projection often does irreversible harm before they recognize the pattern. People in their sphere may take years to recover. Some never do. The dreams at this stage become nightmares of causing harm. Drowning children you were supposed to save, being monsters in others' dreams, doctors who are actually killers, helping that becomes hurting. The unconscious knows you've crossed a line. This stage requires immediate withdrawal from helping roles and intensive analysis or therapy, not self-help, not workshops. Deep, sustained work with someone who can hold you accountable for your shadow. Without this intervention, the progression continues. Danger 4, psychic inflation and messianic complex. At this stage, the wounded healer stops seeing themselves as human. They've fully identified with the archetype. They believe they are the healer, the chosen one, the person who can save others because they're fundamentally different and superior. This is inflation in Jung's technical sense, the ego inflating to archetypal proportions. You lose your humanity and become possessed by something larger than yourself. And paradoxically, this feels spiritual. It feels like enlightenment. It feels like you've transcended normal human limitations. You develop grandiose beliefs. You're here to heal the collective. You've been chosen for this work. You have access to wisdom others don't. Normal boundaries don't apply to you because your work is too important. You see signs and synchronicities everywhere confirming your special role. You may develop a following, people who call you a healer, a shaman, a guru. And instead of deflecting this attention, you absorb it as confirmation. You start believing your own mythology. Jung was particularly concerned about this stage because it's often when the wounded healer causes maximum collective harm. This is when therapists start cults, when spiritual teachers sexually exploit students, while framing it as tantric initiation. When healers convince vulnerable people to stop medical treatment in favor of their methods, the inflation makes you impervious to feedback. Anyone who questions you is not ready for this level of work or too wounded to understand. You surround yourself with people who reinforce your grandiosity and exile anyone who challenges you. You stop doing your own integration work because you believe you've already integrated. You're teaching transformation without being transformed. You're guiding others through territories you haven't actually crossed yourself. The dreams at this stage often involve flying, having superpowers, being worshipped, or standing on mountaintops above everyone else. But these are compensation dreams, the unconscious trying to balance the inflation with warning symbols. And then the counter-movement begins, because inflation in Jungian psychology is always followed by deflation. The psyche won't tolerate ego inflation indefinitely. It will force a correction. This correction is usually catastrophic. The inflated healer is exposed. Their shadow is revealed publicly. Their methods fail dramatically. Their followers abandon them. Their reputation collapses. Or their body forces the issue through severe illness. Or they have a complete psychological breakdown. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. The savior becomes the villain. The healer becomes the wounded. The one who claimed to help everyone becomes the one no one will help. The fall from inflation is brutal because the ego has nothing to land on. You've been operating from archetypal identification for so long that there's no actual self underneath. When the inflation collapses, you don't return to normal human functioning. You plummet into the final danger. Danger 5. Soul death and the abyss. This is what Jung warned about most seriously. He called it psychic death, a state he considered worse than physical death because the personality fragments entirely and there may be no recovery. This isn't depression. This isn't burnout. This is complete disintegration of the self. At this stage, the wounded healer has given themselves so completely to others that there's nothing left. They've emptied themselves entirely, and now they're facing the void they've been fleeing their entire life. Everything that gave life meaning is revealed as false. The helping was compulsion, not compassion. The empathy was defense, not gift. The sensitivity was trauma, not spirituality. The entire identity was constructed to avoid this moment, and now that identity has collapsed. Jung observed that patients at this stage often experienced what looked like psychotic breaks. They lost the ability to distinguish reality from projection. They had bizarre thoughts about being possessed or controlled. They experienced depersonalization and derealization, feeling like they weren't real or the world wasn't real. But Jung understood this differently than conventional psychiatry. He saw it not as illness, but as the psyche's last attempt at transformation. The ego was being destroyed so something more authentic could emerge. But without guidance, without a container, without understanding what was happening, most people didn't survive the process intact. Some became permanently psychotic. Some committed suicide. Some stabilized into a kind of living death, going through motions but with no inner life. Some spent years in psychiatric institutions being medicated for conditions that were actually spiritual emergencies, misunderstood as mental illness. The physical manifestations at this stage are severe. Complete exhaustion that feels cellular, immune system collapse, chronic infections, sometimes cancer. The body has been overridden so long that it's shutting down. But the psychic manifestations are more disturbing. Intrusive thoughts about harming yourself or others, inability to feel anything except intermittent terror, loss of capacity for connection. Even when people try to help, you can't receive it. Experiences of profound unreality where nothing seems to matter because nothing seems to exist. The dreams at this stage, when sleep is even possible, are apocalyptic. Worlds ending, everyone dying, you being dead but still conscious, drowning in darkness, being buried alive. These are underworld dreams, but without the shamanic structure that would make them transformative rather than annihilating. Jung's clinical observation was that people who reached this stage without intervention rarely recovered fully. Even with intensive analysis, the damage to the personality was often permanent. They might stabilize, they might find ways to function, but something essential had been destroyed. And here's what makes this so tragic. This entire progression was preventable. Every single stage was the psyche trying to get the person's attention. Every symptom was compensation, the unconscious saying, "Stop, turn around, face what you're fleeing." But the wounded healer complex is so powerful, so defended, that most people ignore the warnings until it's too late. They push through the vicarious traumatization. They double down when their identity starts dissolving. They inflate to avoid deflating. And by the time they hit the abyss, they have no resources left to climb out. This is why Jung was so insistent that wounded healers need to stop helping and face their wounds before the progression reaches critical stages. Not because he wanted to deprive the world of their gifts, but because he understood that unintegrated gifts eventually become curses for the healer and everyone they touch. The question is, where are you on this progression? If you're in danger 1 or 2, you still have time to intervene before causing harm. If you're in danger 3, you need to withdraw from helping roles immediately and get intensive support. If you're in danger 4, you're in crisis, whether you recognize it or not, and intervention is urgent. If you're approaching danger 5, you need emergency psychological care from someone who understands Jungian psychology and spiritual emergence. Most people watching this video are likely somewhere in the first 3 dangers. You're exhausted from absorbing others' pain. You don't know who you are without your helping role. And if you're brutally honest, you can recognize that you've probably harmed people while believing you were helping them. That recognition is excruciating, but it's also the doorway to transformation. Because here's what Jung discovered through his own near-psychotic break and decades of clinical work. This progression is reversible. Not easily, not quickly, but completely. The wounded healer who consciously chooses to face their wound, to withdraw from compulsive helping, to descend into the material they've been avoiding, that person can transform entirely. They can integrate the split between wounded child and compulsive helper. They can develop a genuine self underneath the helper role. They can become authentically useful instead of compulsively helpful. But the transformation requires following a specific path. Jung mapped this path through his own descent and through working with hundreds of wounded healers. He called it the individuation process, specifically oriented toward integrating the wounded healer complex. And that's what we're exploring next. Jung's complete solution. Not a quick fix, not a 10-step program, but a genuine archetypal initiation that transforms the curse of the wounded empath into the medicine the world actually needs. This is the hero's journey for healers, the shamanic descent that turns the raw wound into integrated wisdom, the alchemical process that transforms lead into gold. But I need to warn you, Jung's solution is harder than continuing to operate as a dark healer. It requires giving up your identity, facing your shadow, sitting with unbearable pain, and dying to who you thought you were. Most people, when confronted with this path, choose to keep suffering in familiar ways rather than transform through unfamiliar territory. They'd rather slowly disintegrate as a helper than rapidly descend as a human being seeking wholeness. But if you've made it this far in this video, you're probably not most people. You're probably one of the rare ones willing to look at the darkness honestly. You're probably ready to stop performing healing and start becoming whole. So let's walk the path Jung mapped. Let's see what genuine integration actually requires. Let's discover what becomes possible when the wounded healer finally, terrifyingly, turns to face their own wound with the same care they've been giving everyone else. Jung's solution to the wounded healer complex isn't a technique. It's not something you can do in a weekend workshop or implement through a 10-step program. It's a complete reorientation of the personality, what he called individuation. But for wounded healers specifically, Jung prescribed a particular form of individuation, one that addresses the unique pathology of the helper complex while honoring the genuine gift underneath the wound. Let me be clear about what this requires. You have to stop helping others and turn all that care toward yourself. Not temporarily, not partially, completely. This is what most wounded healers find impossible. Because stopping means facing the void. Stopping means losing your identity. Stopping means experiencing the terror you've been managing through others for decades. But Jung was unequivocal. The physician who wishes to help a human being must be able to accept him as he is. And he must have already learned to accept himself. The wounded healer hasn't learned to accept themselves. They've accepted everyone else while rejecting the one person who actually needs their acceptance. So the individuation path for wounded healers begins with what Jung called withdrawing projections. This means recognizing what belongs to you versus what belongs to others, and stopping the unconscious transfer of your material onto them. Here's how this works practically. You start tracking your reactions to others. When someone's pain triggers an intense response in you, that urgency to help, that feeling that you can't rest until they're okay, that sense that their suffering is unbearable, you pause. Instead of moving toward them, you turn inward. You ask, what in me is being activated right now? What old wound is this touching? What part of me needs the helping I'm about to give them? This is excruciating because it breaks the compulsive helping cycle. Your nervous system goes into withdrawal. You feel anxious, agitated, useless. Every instinct screams at you to help them, fix them, rescue them, but you stay with yourself instead. Jung called this ethical suffering, consciously bearing your own pain rather than distributing it. This is different from the empathic martyr's suffering. The martyr suffers unconsciously, which makes them a victim. Ethical suffering is conscious. You're choosing to stay with your discomfort rather than avoiding it through helping others. As you withdraw projections, you start to see how much of your helping was actually about managing your own anxiety. The person you were helping didn't always need help. You needed them to need help. Their dysfunction was regulating your nervous system. This recognition brings shame, crushing, humiliating shame, because you have to admit you weren't as pure-hearted as you believed. You were using people, not maliciously, but unconsciously. Jung insisted this shame must be fully felt, not bypassed with spiritual platitudes about we're all doing our best, not intellectualized into psychological theory, actually felt in the body with all its burning humiliation, because shame is the gateway to the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is everything about yourself that you've denied, repressed, or refused to acknowledge. For wounded healers, the shadow contains all the parts that contradict the helping identity: selfishness, rage, manipulation, the need for control, the desire for power, narcissistic needs for admiration. Shadow integration requires what Jung called active imagination, a specific practice of dialoguing with unconscious content as if it were a separate person. For wounded healers, this means personifying and dialoguing with both the wounded child part and the compulsive healer part as separate figures inside you. Not metaphorically, actually. You sit in meditation or journaling and you invite the wounded child forward. You ask, who are you? What do you need? What have you been trying to tell me? And you wait for the response, which might come as images, as sensations, as words that don't feel like your normal voice. The wounded child usually says something like, "You abandoned me. You promised to take care of me, but you've been taking care of everyone else. I'm still here, still terrified, still in pain, and you keep ignoring me to save people who aren't even asking for it." This is devastating to hear, because it's true. Then you invite the healer figure forward, the part that compulsively helps, that identifies with being the rescuer. You ask, "Who are you? What do you need from me?" And this figure usually reveals itself as a defense mechanism, a survival strategy, a part that developed to protect the wounded child but has become tyrannical. The healer figure might say, "I keep you safe. If you're helping others, you don't have to feel your own pain. If you're needed, you won't be abandoned. I've protected you your whole life, but I'm exhausted, and I'm harming people now. I need you to take over." The goal of active imagination isn't to destroy these parts or choose between them. It's to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold both the wounded child and the healer in consciousness simultaneously without identifying with either. This creates what Jung called the ego-self axis, a relationship between the conscious ego and the deeper self that orchestrates the personality. The ego stops trying to control everything and learns to listen to the self's guidance. For wounded healers, this means the helping impulse remains, but it's no longer compulsive. You can help when it's actually appropriate without losing yourself. You can recognize when someone doesn't need help without feeling useless. You can say no without guilt. You can receive help without discomfort. But getting to this place requires descending into the wound you've been circling your entire life. Jung's method for this descent is specific. You must stop all compulsive helping activities and enter what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. This means creating space, sometimes months or years, where your only job is your own integration. This might mean taking a leave from your helping profession. It definitely means stopping the emotional caretaking in personal relationships. It requires saying to friends and family, "I can't be your therapist anymore. I need to focus on my own healing." People will resist this. They're used to you being available, sacrificial, endlessly giving. When you withdraw that, they experience it as abandonment. Some relationships will end. That's part of the process, discovering which relationships were actually based on you being a function rather than a person. During this withdrawal period, everything you've been avoiding through helping will surface. The grief, the rage, the terror, the emptiness, the shame, all of it. Jung insisted on working with the dream content during this phase. Dreams are the unconscious's way of compensating for ego consciousness. When the ego is stuck in patterns, dreams show the opposite to create balance. For wounded healers in descent, dreams typically follow a progression. First, dreams of death, destruction, the world ending. These are ego death dreams. The helper identity is dying. Then, dreams of being in dark places, caves, basements, underwater, underground. These are underworld dreams, showing you're descending into the unconscious. Next, dreams of encountering monsters, shadows, frightening figures. These are shadow integration dreams. You're meeting the parts of yourself you've been denying. Eventually, dreams of finding treasures in dark places, keys, light emerging, babies being born. These are rebirth dreams, signs that something new is forming. Finally, dreams of mandalas, sacred geometry, balanced symbols. These are self-dreams. The deep center is consolidating the transformed personality. But you can't force this progression. You can't make yourself have rebirth dreams through positive thinking. The process has its own timeline, and it's usually longer than your ego wants it to be. Jung estimated that genuine integration of a major complex like the wounded healer takes minimum 2 to 3 years of intensive work. Most people need longer. He spent 6 years in his own confrontation with the unconscious before he felt stable enough to return to full practice. This is why most wounded healers don't integrate. 2 to 3 years feels impossible when your identity and income depend on helping. So they stay in the complex, continuing to harm while believing they help, until eventually they hit the catastrophic dangers we explored earlier. But for those willing to make the descent, Jung laid out specific practices to support the process. The daily shadow inventory. Every evening you review your day, looking for moments when you helped but felt resentful, when you gave advice you don't follow yourself, when you felt superior to less aware people, when you needed someone to have problems. You write these down without judgment, just tracking the shadow in action. Boundary practice. You consciously practice saying no to helping requests, sitting with the anxiety that follows, and tracking what beliefs surface. If I don't help them, they'll suffer. I'm the only one who understands. I'll be abandoned if I'm not useful. These beliefs are identified and questioned. Ethical suffering practice. You set aside time daily, even just 20 minutes, to sit with your own pain without fixing it, analyzing it, or spiritualizing it, just feeling the raw emotion in your body. This builds tolerance for your own discomfort, so you stop needing to manage it through others. Projection withdrawal exercise. When you notice strong reactions to someone, judgment, excessive sympathy, feeling responsible for them, you journal. What I'm seeing in them that's actually in me is. This practice slowly reveals how much of your helping is projection management, active imagination, regular dialogue with inner figures, the wounded child, the compulsive healer, the shadow, and eventually, the self. This creates internal differentiation so you're not possessed by any single part. Body work. Because trauma is stored somatically, intellectual work alone isn't sufficient. Jung recommended what we'd now call somatic experiencing, tracking body sensations, allowing shaking and emotional release, learning to stay present with intense physical feelings without dissociating. All of these practices share a common purpose. They force you to stay with yourself rather than escaping into others. They build what Jung called ego strength, the capacity to hold tension without collapsing or avoiding. And as ego strength builds, something remarkable happens. You start to experience yourself as real, not as a helper, not as a function, but as an actual person with needs, preferences, limits, and a right to exist separate from your utility to others. This sounds simple, but for wounded healers, it's revolutionary. Your entire identity has been organized around being for others, discovering that you can exist as yourself, independent of helping, independent of being needed, independent of managing anyone else's emotions, is a death and a birth simultaneously. Jung called this the emergence of the authentic personality, not the persona, not the role, not the complex, but the actual you, quirky, limited, flawed, human, and real. And paradoxically, it's only from this authentic personality that genuine helping becomes possible. The integrated wounded healer helps differently than the compulsive wounded healer. They help from fullness, not from emptiness. They help when asked, not compulsively. They can receive help, not just give it. They have clear boundaries, not enmeshment. They can let people struggle, not rescue prematurely. They celebrate others' growth, not feel threatened by it. They acknowledge their limits, not inflate their capacities. They work from consciousness, not from compensation. Most importantly, they can help without needing to be needed. That's the entire difference. The unintegrated wounded healer creates dependence because their nervous system requires it. The integrated wounded healer creates autonomy because they're no longer dependent on others' dependence. Jung saw this transformation in his own practice. After his 6-year confrontation with the unconscious, he returned to seeing patients, but in a completely different way. He was no longer trying to cure them. He was accompanying them through their own individuation process, knowing that each person must find their own way through their own darkness. He wrote, "The healer who has faced his own abyss doesn't try to prevent others from facing theirs. He simply offers light, not rescue, presence, not solutions, companionship in the darkness, not elimination of the darkness." This is the medicine of the integrated wounded healer, not the wound itself, not the helping itself, but the consciousness that comes from having survived your own wound and made it conscious. That consciousness is the actual healing agent, not your techniques, not your empathy, not your sensitivity. Your consciousness of your own shadow, your own limits, your own wound. That's what creates safe space for others to face theirs. But, and this is crucial, this integration isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing practice. The wounded healer complex doesn't disappear completely. It remains as a potential that can be reactivated under stress. Jung insisted on regular maintenance work for integrated wounded healers, ongoing therapy or analysis for yourself, not just for your clients. Regular supervision with someone who can spot when you're slipping back into complex, sabbaticals from helping work to check in with yourself, community with other integrated healers who can offer mutual accountability, vigilance about the subtle signs of relapse, fatigue, resentment, inflation, boundary erosion. This is lifelong work because the wounded healer archetype is powerful, and unconsciousness is always easier than consciousness. You can integrate deeply and still find yourself suddenly back in the pattern during a crisis or period of stress. But the difference is, once you've integrated, you recognize the pattern faster. You catch yourself. You have tools. You know the way back. The relapses are shorter, less destructive, more easily corrected, and over time, with continued consciousness, the authentic personality becomes more stable. The helping that emerges is genuine rather than compulsive. The empathy is discerning rather than boundaryless. The gift is real rather than being a sophisticated defense. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The wounded healer heals not by their strength, but by having survived their weakness and made it conscious." Your wound isn't the problem. Your unconsciousness about your wound is the problem. Make it conscious and everything changes. But don't take my word for it. History provides perfect case studies. Wounded healers who attempted this work and either succeeded catastrophically or transformed completely. In the next section, we're going to examine both outcomes. The failures, brilliant helpers who became possessed by the complex and caused massive harm, and the successes, people who did the integration work and became genuinely transformative forces. Because seeing the contrast makes clear, this choice is binary. There's no middle path. You either integrate and transform, or you stay unconscious and eventually cause harm. Let's look at who failed and why, and then who succeeded and how. Because in their stories, you'll see your own potential for destruction or for genuine healing power. Jung understood something crucial. The wounded healer archetype is neutral. It's pure potential energy, but that energy can express as either catastrophic harm or profound transformation, depending entirely on whether the individual makes it conscious. History provides perfect examples of both outcomes. Let's start with the failures, not to judge these people, but to understand the trajectory of unconscious possession, because these weren't bad people. They were gifted healers who never did their own integration work, and the results were devastating. Wilhelm Reich, the healer who became his own shadow. Wilhelm Reich started as one of Freud's most brilliant students. He developed revolutionary body-oriented psychotherapy, recognizing decades before anyone else that trauma is stored somatically. He could sense blocked energy in patients' bodies and develop techniques to release it. His early work was genuine genius. He understood that psychological healing requires physical release. He mapped character armor, the muscular patterns that hold trauma in place. He was helping people in profound ways. But Reich had massive unintegrated trauma, an abusive childhood, early sexual experiences that left him confused and ashamed, and a pattern of compulsive sexuality that he never examined. Instead, he developed elaborate theories about orgone energy, a universal life force he claimed to have discovered. This was inflation beginning. Reich started to believe he'd found the secret, not just to psychological healing, but to physical health, to weather control, even to cancer treatment. He built orgone accumulators, boxes he claimed could concentrate this energy and cure disease. Jung would have recognized this immediately as ego inflation, the conscious personality identifying with archetypal power rather than being in service to it. Reich stopped being a therapist in relationship with healing energy. He started believing he was the source of that energy. The progression accelerated. Reich became increasingly paranoid, believing that government agencies were persecuting him because his discoveries threatened the establishment. He claimed UFOs were depleting Earth's orgone energy. He insisted he could control weather patterns to prevent drought. His followers became cultish. They defended his increasingly bizarre claims. They isolated him from criticism, and Reich, surrounded only by believers, descended further into what can only be described as psychosis with a sophisticated theoretical framework. The ending was tragic. The FDA investigated his orgone accumulators as fraudulent medical devices. Reich refused to cooperate with the investigation, claiming the government had no authority to evaluate his work. He was held in contempt of court. He was imprisoned, and he died in federal prison in 1957, still believing he was a persecuted genius rather than recognizing he'd become possessed by his own unintegrated shadow. What happened? Reich's gift was real. His body-oriented approach was decades ahead of its time, but he never integrated his own sexual trauma, his own rage, his own childhood wound. Instead, he projected outward, creating theories about universal energy while his own energy remained blocked and unconscious. The wounded healer who doesn't face their wound eventually becomes dangerous, not because they lose their gifts, but because the gifts become vehicles for the unconscious shadow. Reich's brilliance didn't disappear. It was hijacked by his unintegrated complex and used to build increasingly elaborate defensive structures. Fritz Perls, the shadow beneath the Gestalt. Fritz Perls founded Gestalt therapy, another revolutionary approach emphasizing present moment awareness and taking responsibility for one's experience. His empty chair technique helped thousands of people dialogue with internalized figures. He was charismatic, brilliant, and deeply wounded. Perls had a terrible childhood, an abusive father, a mother he described as cold and contemptuous. He grew up feeling worthless and compensated by becoming the center of attention. His entire therapeutic approach, while genuinely helpful, was also a sophisticated performance. What makes Perls's case disturbing is that his shadow was visible but rationalized. He was openly predatory toward female clients and students. He sexualized therapeutic relationships constantly. He used Gestalt principles to justify boundary violations, claiming that authentic living meant following your desires without conventional restrictions. His students and followers knew about this behavior, but they'd been trained in his method to take responsibility for their own experience. So when women felt violated by his sexual advances, they were taught to examine their own resistance rather than recognizing his behavior as predatory. This is the dark healer at full operation. Perls developed a therapeutic system that was genuinely transformative for some people, but that also provided theoretical cover for his own unconscious compulsions. He never faced his own childhood wound, his own shame, his own desperate need for validation through sexual conquest. The contrast between his brilliant insights about responsibility and his complete irresponsibility about his own behavior is striking. He could see others' patterns with laser accuracy, but was entirely blind to his own. Classic projection, the unhealed wound, turning the healer into exactly what they claimed to transform. Pearls died in 1970, having helped thousands of people, but also having caused deep harm to many, particularly women. His legacy is complex. Brilliant therapeutic innovations entangled with unethical behavior that his own theory was used to rationalize. The cult leader pattern, Jim Jones, David Koresh, and others. Many cult leaders begin as genuine wounded healers. Jim Jones started as a social justice activist genuinely helping poor and marginalized communities. David Koresh had profound mystical experiences and biblical insights that attracted sincere seekers. But what all cult leaders share is this: they had genuine gifts combined with massive unintegrated trauma, and they surrounded themselves with people who reinforced their inflation rather than challenging it. Jung saw this pattern emerging in several of his own students who went on to create what were essentially therapeutic cults. They'd had breakthrough experiences in their analysis with Jung, developed real insight, then stopped their own integration work and started teaching prematurely. The cult leader is the wounded healer who achieves stage 4 inflation, the messianic complex, without the compensatory deflation that would force integration. They identify completely with the healer archetype. They believe they have special access to truth. They create hierarchies with themselves at the center, and they attract wounded people who need a savior, which reinforces the leader's inflated identity. The progression is predictable: isolation from feedback, increasing control over followers, sexualization of power relationships, paranoia about outside threats, and eventually catastrophic endings, mass suicide, violent confrontation with authorities, or implosion from internal contradictions. What's crucial to understand: these people weren't evil from the start. They were wounded healers with real gifts who never did the integration work. The gift became the vehicle for the wound. The healing power became control power. The spiritual insight became grandiosity. Jung's observation was clear: without individuation, without shadow work, without conscious relationship to the archetype, the wounded healer will eventually cause harm proportional to their gifts. The more powerful the gift, the more dangerous the unconscious shadow. Now let's look at the other side: wounded healers who did the integration work and transformed completely. Viktor Frankl, Integration Through Auschwitz. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, but his transformation didn't happen in the concentration camp. It happened after, when he had to integrate what he'd experienced. Frankl could have become bitter, traumatized, unable to function. Instead, he spent years processing his experience through writing, therapy, and developing what became logotherapy, therapy based on finding meaning, even in suffering. But here's what's crucial: Frankl didn't start teaching immediately. He didn't position himself as someone who had transcended trauma. He spent years grieving his losses: his wife who died in the camps, his parents, his unborn child, his entire world. He faced the rage at God, at humanity, at the randomness of who lived and who died. He examined his own choices in the camp, moments he wasn't proud of, times he'd acted selfishly to survive. He integrated his shadow, the part of him that had been willing to do whatever it took to live. Only after this integration did he begin teaching, and his teaching came from genuine integration, not from bypassing. He didn't deny the horror. He didn't spiritualize it into everything happens for a reason. He held the tension between meaninglessness and meaning, and taught others how to find meaning, despite, not because of, suffering. Frankl's work has helped millions precisely because it came from integrated experience, not unprocessed trauma. He was a wounded healer who faced his wound consciously and emerged transformed rather than possessed. Marion Woodman, the anorexic who became the guide. Marion Woodman was a Jungian analyst who nearly died from anorexia in her 40s. She'd been a perfect student, perfect teacher, perfect daughter, and was slowly starving herself to death maintaining that perfection. Her breakdown and hospitalization forced her to face everything she'd been avoiding: rage at her controlling mother, shame about her body, terror of her own desires, the way she'd used perfectionism and control to manage unbearable feelings. She spent 5 years in intensive Jungian analysis. She stopped teaching. She stopped being the helper. She focused entirely on her own healing, and in that process she discovered the feminine principle that had been murdered in her psyche. The body, the instinct, the earth, the wildness. When she returned to teaching and analysis practice, she'd been transformed. Her work focused specifically on helping women integrate body and psyche, particularly women with eating disorders and compulsive patterns. But she taught from having survived and integrated, not from unprocessed trauma. Her books and lectures have this quality of hard-won wisdom. She doesn't speak from theory, but from having descended into her own underworld and returned. She admits her struggles, her relapses, her ongoing work. She positions herself as a fellow traveler, not a guru. This is the integrated wounded healer. Genuine humility born from having faced your own capacity for self-destruction and your own need for help. Woodman could help others precisely because she'd stopped pretending she didn't need help herself. Jung himself, the model of integration. Jung is the ultimate case study because his confrontation with the unconscious, after breaking with Freud, nearly destroyed him and could easily have turned him into a cult leader or a madman. Between 1913 and 1919, Jung experienced visions, heard voices, and came close to complete psychosis. He saw apocalyptic images of blood flooding Europe, which manifested as World War I. He dialogued with inner figures who claimed to be spirits. He felt possessed by forces beyond his understanding. He could have interpreted this as spiritual enlightenment, positioned himself as a prophet, gathered followers around his visions. Many people in similar states do exactly that and become dangerous. But Jung made a different choice. He recognized he was in psychological crisis. He withdrew from public teaching. He maintained only a small practice to support himself financially, and he spent years trying to understand what was happening to him psychologically rather than inflating it into mystical specialness. He developed active imagination specifically to dialogue with these inner figures while maintaining ego consciousness. He recorded everything in what became the Red Book, not to publish and proclaim, but to track and understand. He faced his own shadow material that emerged, his grandiosity, his messianic fantasies, his capacity for cruelty, his sexual confusion, his rage at Freud and at authority generally. He didn't bypass this dark material, he integrated it. The crucial point: Jung spent 6 years in descent before he returned to teaching. And when he returned, he taught from integration, not from the raw wound. He didn't say, "I had visions, follow me." He said, "I nearly lost my mind. Here's what I learned about how the psyche works." His entire body of work, Archetypes, the collective unconscious, Individuation, shadow integration, came from having survived his own confrontation with unconscious forces and made them conscious. He was the wounded healer who became the integrated healer by doing the work he would later prescribe for others. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Reich, Pearls, and the cult leaders had real gifts, but never integrated their shadows. They became possessed by their complexes and caused harm. Frankl, Woodman, and Jung faced their wounds consciously, integrated their shadows, and became genuine agents of transformation. What's the difference? Time, withdrawal, and willingness to be nobody for a while. The failed healers kept teaching, kept helping, kept positioning themselves as special. They used their roles to avoid their own work. The successful healers withdrew, stopped helping others, focused on their own integration, and only returned to service after genuine transformation. This is Jung's central prescription for wounded healers. You must stop helping and face yourself first, not because helping is bad, but because unconscious helping perpetuates what it claims to heal. The integrated healer emerges from years of facing their own darkness. The dark healer emerges from avoiding that descent and projecting the darkness onto others while claiming to help them. Which path you take determines not just your own fate, but the fate of everyone you attempt to help. It's that serious, it's that crucial, and the path of integration has a specific map, which we're going to explore in practical detail in the next section. Because Jung didn't just say, do shadow work. He laid out specific daily practices that support the integration process. These aren't optional. They're not suggestions. They're requirements for anyone who wants to transform from dark healer to integrated healer. Let's look at the tools. To truly understand what Jung discovered about the wounded healer, we need to examine his own descent. Because Jung didn't develop his psychology through theoretical speculation. He developed it through surviving his own near-psychotic break and documenting what he found in the abyss. The Red Book, which Jung kept hidden for decades and was only published in 2009, 48 years after his death, contains the raw record of his confrontation with the unconscious. Reading it is like witnessing someone balanced on the edge between transformation and madness. And it reveals something crucial. Jung was a wounded healer in danger of becoming a dark healer, and only his willingness to descend saved him, and saved his patients from the harm he would have caused if he'd remained unconscious. Let's trace the journey, the break with Freud, the wound exposed. In 1913, Jung's professional and personal relationship with Sigmund Freud collapsed. This wasn't just a professional disagreement, it was a devastating psychological rupture. Freud had been Jung's mentor, father figure, and the one person who had validated Jung's intellectual gifts and psychological insights. For Jung, this break reactivated his childhood wound. His own father had been a weak, depressed minister who couldn't answer young Karl's spiritual questions. Jung had felt intellectually abandoned by his father, left alone with questions too large for a child to hold. Freud had filled that void, and now Freud was gone. Worse, Freud had rejected him, declared him a heretic, turned the psychoanalytic community against him. Jung was 38 years old, professionally successful, with a family and a growing practice. On the surface, everything was fine. But internally, he was fragmenting. He began having visions, apocalyptic images of blood flooding Europe, of thousands drowning, of entire civilizations collapsing. At first, he thought he was going mad. Then World War I began in 1914, and the visions seemed prophetic. This was even more disturbing. Was he seeing the future? Was he possessed by something beyond himself? Jung made the crucial decision. He would withdraw from public life and investigate these experiences systematically, not as mystical revelations, but as psychological phenomena arising from his own unconscious. This decision saved him because he could have easily interpreted the visions as proof of his special powers, gathered followers, positioned himself as a prophet. The wounded healer's inflation was right there, available, tempting. But Jung's scientific training gave him a different framework. These were compensatory images from the unconscious, and he needed to understand them, not be possessed by them. The descent. Active imagination with inner figures. Jung began a practice he called active imagination. deliberately entering a meditative state and allowing images and figures to emerge from the unconscious, then dialoguing with them as if they were real people. This sounds simple. It's terrifying. The first figure who appeared was Elijah, an old prophet, accompanied by a young blind woman named Salome. Jung was disturbed by the pairing. In mythology, Salome was the seductress who demanded John the Baptist's head. Why was she with the prophet, and why was she blind? In his dialogues recorded in the Red Book, Jung asked Elijah about this. The old man explained that he and Salome had been together since eternity, that insight and desire, spirit and body, are always paired, and that Salome was blind because Eros doesn't see, it feels. This was Jung's unconscious teaching him about integration. The prophet without the embodied feminine becomes disembodied spirituality. The feminine without the prophet becomes blind instinct. Both need each other. But then the figures transformed. Elijah became Philemon, a pagan wise man with the wings of a kingfisher, and Philemon began teaching Jung things that Jung consciously didn't know. This is where it gets psychologically dangerous. Philemon seemed to have autonomous existence. He would appear in Jung's imagination and tell him things that contradicted Jung's conscious beliefs. Jung would argue with him, and Philemon would respond with wisdom Jung couldn't have constructed intellectually. Jung later wrote, "Philemon represented a force which was not myself. In my fantasies, I held conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought, for I observed clearly that it was he who spoke, not I." This is the edge between transformation and psychosis. Jung was experiencing what looked like hearing voices, what psychiatry would call auditory hallucinations, but he maintained enough ego consciousness to recognize these as psychological phenomena. Autonomous complexes personified aspects of the collective unconscious. If Jung had identified with Philemon, he would have become inflated, claiming special knowledge from spiritual sources. If he'd been terrified of Philemon, he might have suppressed the experiences and lost access to the unconscious. Instead, he stayed in relationship with Philemon, learning from him while maintaining his own separate consciousness. This is the transcendent function in action, holding the tension between conscious ego and unconscious content without being possessed by either. The shadow emerges, facing his own darkness, but Philemon wasn't the only figure Jung encountered. There were darker ones. He dialogued with his own shadow, the parts of himself he'd denied or repressed, and what emerged was disturbing. Jung discovered within himself a rage at authority figures, particularly Freud, that went beyond intellectual disagreement into murderous fantasy. He had to face that part of him wanted to destroy Freud, not just separate from him, a messianic complex, a secret belief that he was chosen to receive special knowledge, that he was meant to be a prophet for a new understanding of the psyche. This was inflation, and Jung had to recognize and own it rather than act it out. Sexual desires and confusions that contradicted his conventional marriage. Jung was attracted to his patients, had affairs, and had to face the shadow side of the healer, using therapeutic relationships for personal gratification, a contempt for ordinary people who weren't as psychologically developed as he saw himself. Jung had to confront his own elitism, his secret superiority, complex, a terror of his own ordinariness, that underneath all his brilliance, he might be nothing special at all, just another wounded person trying to make sense of pain. Facing this material nearly destroyed Jung's ego, because his identity had been built on being the brilliant, insightful, morally upright doctor. Discovering his shadow meant the death of that identity. In the Red Book, Jung recorded a dialogue with his soul where she tells him, "You should not resist. You wanted to accept everything, so accept this too. This belongs to you." You cannot say that you have accepted yourself if you accept only the beautiful and the good in you and refuse the ugly and evil. This is the core of shadow work. It's not about eliminating your darkness. It's about acknowledging that it's yours. Jung had to admit, yes, I have rage. Yes, I have grandiosity. Yes, I manipulate. Yes, I use people. Yes, I'm terrified. All of this is me. The temptation was enormous to project this material back onto Freud, onto his critics, onto anyone else, to say they're the ones with problems, not me. But Jung stayed with his own darkness, the wounded healer complex revealed. Through this descent, Jung began to understand his own wounded healer complex. He saw how his entire career had been organized around a wound he'd never fully acknowledged. He'd become a psychiatrist to understand his own psychological fragmentation. He'd developed theories about the psyche to explain his own inner experiences. He'd been helping patients while unconsciously trying to heal himself through them. This recognition was excruciating because it meant his helping hadn't been as pure as he'd believed. He'd been using his patients, not consciously, not maliciously, but using them nonetheless, as vehicles for working out his own psychological material. One particularly powerful Red Book entry describes Jung's realization that he'd been identifying with the healer archetype rather than being in service to it. He'd made himself into the wise old man, the one who knows, the one who sees. And this inflation was a defense against his own woundedness. He wrote, "I must go down into the depth so that I might learn that the spirit of the depth is not the spirit of the ego, that I am not special, that I am a wounded man like all men." This is the key transformation. Jung had to die to his identity as the special one, the healer, the prophet. He had to become ordinary, wounded human. The dark night, suicidal ideation and fragmentation. The descent reached its darkest point around 1916. Jung experienced what he later described as a kind of death. His personality was fragmenting. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. He had periods where he couldn't tell if he was experiencing his own thoughts or being invaded by external forces. He had suicidal thoughts, not from depression, but from a sense that his ego was dissolving and taking him with it. He later wrote that he understood why some people who undergo this kind of psychological transformation don't survive it, because there are moments when annihilation feels like the only relief from the terror. His family was concerned. His wife Emma, who was also studying psychology, could see he was in crisis but couldn't reach him. He'd withdrawn into himself almost completely, but Jung had one anchor, his commitment to consciousness. Even in the darkest moments, he maintained a kind of witness awareness, documenting what was happening, trying to understand it psychologically rather than being entirely consumed by it. He continued seeing a few patients during this time, which was probably a mistake, but it also forced him to maintain some connection to external reality. He had to show up, be functional, hold space for others, even while internally disintegrating. Years later, Jung admitted that this was dangerous, that he probably shouldn't have been practicing during his worst periods. He recognized that his own crisis was leaking into his work with patients. This honesty is crucial. Jung wasn't claiming he handled everything perfectly. He was admitting he made mistakes. The turning point, differentiation from the archetype. The turning point came when Jung realized he had to differentiate himself from the archetypal material he was experiencing. He wasn't the wise man, he was a man in relationship with wisdom. He wasn't the prophet, he was a person receiving prophetic images from the collective unconscious. This subtle shift was everything. Instead of identifying with Philemon, he began to see Philemon as representing something larger than himself, an aspect of the collective psyche, the wise old man archetype that he could learn from but shouldn't become. He developed what he later called the ego-self axis. the relationship between the conscious ego and the deeper self that organizes the personality. The ego doesn't disappear, but it also doesn't inflate to fill the entire psyche. It becomes a conscious participant in a larger process. Jung described this as learning to listen rather than direct, to serve rather than control, to participate rather than dominate. The ego's job isn't to be the hero, it's to be conscious of what's moving through it. This realization brought stability. Jung's visions and inner experiences continued, but he was no longer terrified by them or inflated by them. He could witness them, learn from them, integrate them without being possessed. The integration, writing as containment. Throughout this entire process, Jung was writing. Not to publish, he kept the Red Book hidden during his lifetime, but to contain the experiences. Writing made them concrete, gave them form, allowed him to examine them at distance. This is a crucial practice Jung later recommended for all wounded healers in descent. Document your process, not to perform it for others, but to create enough distance from the experiences that you're not entirely flooded by them. The Red Book contains paintings Jung did of his visions. The act of painting forced him to slow down, to look at the images carefully, to reproduce them in a way that required conscious attention. This creative engagement with unconscious material is itself integrative. By 1919, Jung felt stable enough to begin teaching again. But he didn't teach about his visions or position himself as a mystic. He taught about the psychological structures he'd discovered through his descent. Archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, shadow work. He framed everything psychologically rather than mystically, not because the mystical component wasn't real, but because he understood that if he emphasized the mystical side, he'd attract followers looking for a guru rather than students looking for psychological understanding. The model for all wounded healers. Jung's journey became the model he prescribed for other wounded healers. Withdrawal. When you're in psychological crisis, stop helping others. Focus on yourself. Don't try to maintain your practice or your helping role while fragmenting. Descent. Turn inward and face what's there. Use active imagination, dream work, creative expression. Don't avoid the darkness or try to transcend it prematurely. Differentiation. Learn to distinguish between you and the archetypal material moving through you. You're not the archetype, you're in relationship with it. Documentation. Write, paint, record your process. Create enough distance from the experiences to examine them consciously. Integration. Take the time you need, years, not months, to integrate what you've discovered. Don't rush back to teaching or helping. Return. When you do return to service, teach from integration, not from raw experience. Help others navigate their own descents, rather than trying to save them from descents. Jung spent 6 years in intensive confrontation with the unconscious. Then he spent the rest of his life teaching what he'd learned, not claiming to have transcended the human condition, but showing others how to navigate it more consciously. He never positioned himself as fully integrated or beyond his shadow. He continued his own analysis. He made mistakes in relationships. He struggled with inflation periodically, but he developed the consciousness to recognize these patterns and correct them. This is the realistic outcome of integration, not perfection, but consciousness. Not eliminating your wounded healer complex, but having a conscious relationship with it so it doesn't possess you. Jung proved that the wounded healer, who descends into their wound and stays there long enough to integrate it, becomes genuinely valuable, not because they've transcended woundedness, but because they've learned to work with it consciously. His entire psychology emerged from this personal crucible, and it remains the most complete map we have for wounded healers trying to transform from dark healers into integrated healers. But the map is useless unless you actually walk it. and walking it requires specific daily practices, not theoretical understanding, but embodied application. That's what we're exploring next. The practical tools Jung developed for wounded healers in the integration process. Not abstract concepts, but concrete practices you can implement today to begin your own conscious descent. Because reading about transformation doesn't transform you. You have to do the work. And the work has specific steps, specific methods, specific practices that support the process without trying to bypass it. Let's get practical. Jung was a practical psychologist. He didn't just theorize about transformation. He developed specific practices to support it. These weren't quick fixes or positive affirmations. They were rigorous daily disciplines designed to build the ego strength necessary to hold the wounded healer tension consciously. What I'm about to share are the actual tools Jung used himself and prescribed for his wounded healer patients. These practices aren't optional suggestions. They're requirements if you want to integrate rather than perpetuate your complex. Let me be clear. These practices are uncomfortable. They'll bring up resistance. Your wounded healer complex will fight against them because they threaten its existence. But that discomfort is the work. If it feels easy, you're probably doing it wrong. Tool 1. The Daily Shadow Inventory. Every evening, spend 15 to 30 minutes reviewing your day, specifically looking for moments when your wounded healer complex was operating unconsciously. Get a dedicated journal. At the top of each entry, write the date and this question: where did I help unconsciously today? Then track these specific patterns, helping when not asked. Did you offer advice, solutions, or emotional support to someone who wasn't requesting it? What was your feeling in that moment? Genuine care or anxiety that needed relief? Resentful giving. Did you help someone but feel resentful afterward? What were you expecting in return that you didn't get? Superior sensing. Did you feel secretly superior to someone who isn't as aware or sensitive as you? What judgment were you making? Boundary violation. Did you absorb someone's emotions, take on their problems, or feel responsible for their feelings? Where did you end and they begin? Advice hypocrisy. Did you give advice you don't follow yourself? What were you projecting onto them that's actually yours? Rescuing compulsion. Did you have an urgent feeling that you needed to fix someone's problem immediately? What would have happened if you'd stayed out of it? Write without editing or censoring. You're not doing this to shame yourself. You're tracking patterns. The unconscious operates in repetition. When you start seeing the same behaviors showing up day after day, you're identifying your complex in action. The key is specificity. Don't write, "I was codependent today." Write, "Sarah called crying about her boyfriend. Before she even asked, I was already giving her advice about leaving him. I felt anxious until she said she'd follow my suggestion. Then I felt calm and purposeful. I realized I needed her to have a problem more than she needed my advice." That's shadow inventory. Concrete, specific, honest. Over weeks and months, patterns become undeniable. You'll start recognizing your complex in real time rather than retrospectively. That's when change becomes possible. Tool 2. Active imagination with inner healer and inner wounded one. This is the practice Jung developed during his Red Book period and considered essential for wounded healers. You're going to personify and dialogue with the two core aspects of your complex, the compulsive healer and the wounded child. Set aside 30 to 60 minutes in a private space where you won't be disturbed. Have your journal ready. Close your eyes and enter a meditative state. Not deep trance, more like a waking dream where you're conscious but relaxed. Invite the wounded child forward. Ask, "Who are you? What do you need? What have you been trying to tell me?" Wait. Don't make up answers. Wait for images, sensations, words, feelings that arise spontaneously. They might not make sense initially. Record them anyway. The wounded child might appear as a literal child at a specific age. They might appear symbolically, a small animal, a locked room, a frozen figure. However they appear, respect it. Ask questions. How long have you been here? What happened to you? What do you need from me? Why have I been avoiding you? The answers often come as feelings first, then images, then eventually words. Don't rush. This isn't an intellectual exercise. It's encountering a dissociated part of yourself that's been buried for decades. When you feel complete with the wounded child, for now, this isn't one and done. Invite the compulsive healer forward. This figure often appears as an adult version of you, but with specific characteristics. Exhausted, depleted, sometimes with a savior complex aura. Ask similar questions. Who are you? What's your job? How long have you been protecting me? What happens if you stop? What do you need? The compulsive healer usually reveals itself as a part that developed to protect the wounded child. It might say something like, if I stop helping others, we'll face what happened, and we can't survive that, so I keep us busy, keep us useful, keep us from feeling the pain. This is the dialogue that changes everything. Recognizing that your helping isn't altruistic. It's a defense mechanism, and it's exhausted. Eventually, you facilitate a conversation between these two parts. Let them talk to each other through you. The wounded child might say, "You abandoned me to take care of everyone else." The healer might respond, "I thought I was protecting you." Don't control this dialogue. Let it unfold. Record everything. The goal isn't to eliminate either part. It's to develop a conscious relationship with both so they're not possessing you unconsciously. You become the container, the witness consciousness that can hold both the wound and the compulsion without being overtaken by either. Practice this weekly at minimum, more if you're in acute crisis. Tool 3, the boundary ritual. Jung developed this visualization practice specifically for empaths who absorb others' energy unconsciously. It's a daily practice of consciously closing and opening your energetic boundaries. Morning practice, 5 10 minutes. Sit quietly. Imagine a flexible, semi-permeable membrane around your body, like skin, but energetic. Visualize this boundary as having a door that you control. State aloud, "Today I choose consciously what I let in and what I keep out. Others' emotions are not mine to carry. I can care without absorbing. I can help without losing myself." Visualize the boundary ceiling, not rigidly but with clear definition. You're inside it. Others are outside it. This doesn't mean you can't connect. It means connection happens through conscious choice, not through unconscious merger. Throughout the day, check your boundary. When you encounter someone in distress, pause before helping. Feel your boundary. Ask, "Is this mine to carry?" If the answer is no, you can offer support without taking on their emotional state. Evening practice, 5 10 minutes. Review moments when your boundary dissolved. Where did you merge with others? Where did you absorb their anxiety, sadness, or chaos? Visualize releasing what you picked up. Imagine energy that doesn't belong to you, flowing back out through your boundary and returning to its source or to the earth. This isn't about being cold or disconnected. It's about developing the capacity for what Jung called conscious participation, being present with others without losing yourself in them. Empaths resist this practice because it feels unloving, but actually having boundaries is more loving. When you're not unconsciously absorbing others' pain, you can actually help them more effectively. You're present rather than merged. You're clear rather than confused. Tool 4, ethical suffering practice. This is Jung's term for consciously bearing your own pain rather than distributing it through helping others. It's sitting with your discomfort without fixing, analyzing, or spiritualizing it. Daily practice, 20-30 minutes. Find a quiet space. Set a timer. Sit in a position that's sustainable, not rigidly uncomfortable, but not so comfortable you'll dissociate. Bring to mind something painful you've been avoiding, a memory, a feeling, a truth about yourself, a loss, a shame. Feel where it lives in your body. Don't think about it. Feel it. Is it in your chest, your throat, your gut? Stay with the physical sensation. When your mind wants to analyze it, tell a story about it or make it mean something. Return to the sensation. This is excruciating for wounded healers. You're trained to move away from pain immediately, either your own or others. This practice requires staying. You'll want to cry, scream, run. Do what you need to express the emotion, but stay in the room. Stay with yourself. Don't call anyone. Don't distract yourself. Don't make it stop. This is what Jung meant by ethical suffering. You're taking responsibility for your own pain. You're not asking anyone to fix it, manage it, or take it away. You're learning that you can survive your own feelings without being destroyed by them. If this feels impossible, start with 5 minutes. Work up gradually, but do it daily, because until you can sit with your own pain, you'll keep managing it through others. Tool 5. The projection withdrawal exercise. When you notice strong reactions to someone, excessive sympathy, judgment, feeling responsible for them, Jung's practice is to investigate the projection. Write, "What I'm seeing in them that's actually in me is..." Then complete the sentence without editing, multiple times if needed. Example, you're intensely focused on a friend who won't leave an abusive relationship. What I'm seeing in them that's actually in me is my own inability to leave situations that hurt me. I'm trapped in my helper role the way they're trapped in their relationship. I'm giving them the advice I need to follow. Leave what's destroying you. This is projection withdrawal. Recognizing that your intense focus on their problem is actually your psyche trying to work on your own problem through them. Once you identify the projection, you have a choice. Work on your issue directly or keep projecting it onto them. Most wounded healers keep projecting because it's easier to fix others than to fix yourself. But projection withdrawal breaks this cycle. You start taking back the energy you've been putting into others' problems and using it for your own healing. Tool 6. Dream work for compensation. Jung insisted that wounded healers track their dreams because dreams reveal what consciousness is avoiding. Keep a dream journal by your bed. Immediately upon waking, record any dreams. Fragments, images, feelings, whatever you remember. Don't interpret them initially, just record them for a few weeks. Then review for patterns. Wounded healers in trouble typically dream drowning, being crushed, carrying impossible weights, martyr complex, teaching in empty rooms, wearing masks, performing wisdom, children who can't leave home, people trapped in houses, devouring mother, father, being in war zones, rescuing people from disasters, trauma collector, being worshipped or exposed as a fraud, shadow healer, inflation, a deflation. These dreams are compensation, the unconscious trying to balance your conscious one-sidedness. If you're consciously identified as the helpful one, dreams show you the part that's drowning under the weight of that role. Pay special attention to recurring dreams. They're persistent messages from the unconscious about patterns that need attention. Work with dreams not by forcing symbolic meaning, but by feeling into them. If you dream of drowning, how does that feel in your body right now? Where in your waking life are you drowning? What do you need to release to come up for air? These 6 tools aren't the complete solution. They're daily practices that support the larger integration process. Think of them as maintenance, like brushing your teeth for psychological health. None of these practices will feel good initially. The wounded healer complex will resist with every tool it has. Too busy, too tired, doesn't matter, already did this work, need to help someone instead. That resistance is the complex protecting itself. Work through it anyway. Jung's observation was that consistent practice of these tools over months and years gradually builds the consciousness necessary to hold the wounded healer tension without being possessed by it. You're not eliminating the complex, you're developing a conscious relationship with it. You're learning to recognize when it's active, what it's protecting against, and how to choose differently in the moment. This is lifelong work, not because you're broken, but because the wounded healer archetype is powerful, and consciousness is easily lost under stress. But with these tools practiced consistently, you'll find that the compulsion to help decreases, while the capacity for genuine service increases. You'll feel less driven and more grounded, less identified with the role and more present as yourself. And you'll begin to understand what Jung meant when he said, "The integrated wounded healer helps not through their gift, but through their consciousness of their wound." That consciousness is the medicine, and it's built through these daily, unglamorous, disciplined practices that slowly transform unconscious helping into conscious service. Next, we need to map the complete transformation arc, the hero's journey specifically for wounded healers, because integration doesn't happen randomly. It follows a predictable progression through 4 distinct stages, each with its own tasks, dangers, and markers of progress. Let's look at the full journey from dark healer to integrated healer. Jung understood that psychological transformation doesn't happen chaotically. It follows archetypal patterns, what Joseph Campbell later called the hero's journey. For wounded healers specifically, Jung mapped a 4-stage transformation arc that moves from unconscious possession to conscious integration. This isn't a linear progression you complete once. It's cyclical. You may move through these stages multiple times at deeper levels, but understanding the map helps you recognize where you are and what's required at each stage. If you're currently a dark healer, this is your roadmap home. Stage 1. Recognition and crisis. The call. Duration. 3 to 6 months. This stage begins when something breaks. The wounded healer has been operating unconsciously, compulsively helping, chronically exhausted, surrounded by wounded people, feeling both essential and empty. Then something forces recognition. Maybe multiple relationships collapse simultaneously. Physical illness that can't be ignored. A helping situation goes catastrophically wrong. Someone you've been helping commits suicide or deteriorates despite your efforts. You have a breakdown and can't maintain the helper role. Someone you trust confronts you about your pattern. You read something, like this script, that mirror reflects your exact pattern. The recognition moment is usually accompanied by intense shame, because suddenly you see what you've been doing. Using people, creating dependence, helping to avoid your own work, harming while believing you were healing. This is the death of the false healer identity, and death, even of something false, is experienced as catastrophic loss. Symptoms of stage 1, acute anxiety or panic attacks, inability to continue helping roles without feeling false, intense shame and self-judgment, questioning everything about your life and relationships, feeling like you don't know who you are, terror about what comes next. Dreams in stage 1, buildings collapsing, earthquakes, tsunamis, death of loved ones, symbolizing death of old self, being exposed or revealed, falling endlessly, being chased by something you can't see. The task of stage 1 is to fully acknowledge the pattern, not to fix it immediately, but to truly see it. This requires brutal honesty, admitting you've harmed people, admitting you've been unconscious, admitting you don't know who you are without the helper role. Most wounded healers try to skip this stage. They want to jump straight to healing themselves, the way they've been helping others with techniques, practices, quick transformations. But stage 1 requires sitting in the recognition without immediately trying to solve it. Jung called this hitting bottom, and he insisted it was necessary, because without the crisis, there's no motivation to do the deep work. The ego will always try to maintain its current structure unless forced to surrender. If you're in stage 1 right now, stop trying to help anyone else. Withdraw from helping roles as much as possible. Find a therapist or analyst who understands Jungian psychology. Tell trusted people you're in crisis. Don't try to hold it together. Fall apart. The falling apart is the beginning of transformation. The danger of stage 1 is either bypassing it through spiritual or intellectual defenses or getting stuck in shame and self-flagellation. You need to move through recognition into descent, not circle endlessly in guilt. Signs you're ready for stage 2. You've stopped defending yourself. You've admitted the pattern to yourself and at least one other person. You're willing to not know who you are for a while, and you're willing to face what you've been fleeing your entire life. Stage 2, descent and shadow work, the ordeal. Duration, 1 to 3 years. This is the longest and most difficult stage. You've recognized the wounded healer pattern. Now you have to face the wound itself, the original trauma that created the complex. Stage 2 is voluntary hell. You're withdrawing from compulsive helping, which means you're no longer anesthetizing yourself through others. All the pain you've been managing externally comes flooding back internally. This stage requires complete withdrawal from helping roles, not reducing them, stopping them. If you're a therapist, you take a leave. If you're the family caretaker, you resign. If you're the friend everyone calls, you become unavailable. This creates panic in your system and in your relationships. People are angry that you're not there for them anymore. Your nervous system is in withdrawal from the helping addiction. You feel useless, worthless, without purpose. Good, that's the point. You're facing what you've been avoiding through helping. Your own emptiness, your own terror, your own rage, your own wound. Symptoms of stage 2. Deep grief that comes in waves. Rage at the people who wounded you originally. Rage at yourself for perpetuating it. Physical illness as the body releases stored trauma. Exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. Periods of depersonalization or dissociation. Intense loneliness, questioning the meaning of everything. Dreams in stage 2. Being in dark places, caves, basements, underwater, underground, encountering monsters, demons, threatening figures, being dismembered or torn apart, descending staircases that go down forever, being in prisons or trapped in small spaces, confronting figures from your past. The work of stage 2 is facing your shadow, all the material you've been projecting onto others. This means facing your wound directly, the childhood trauma, neglect, abuse, abandonment that created the wounded healer complex. Not just talking about it intellectually, but feeling it somatically, grieving what you didn't get, raging at who hurt you, facing the terror of the helpless child who had no protection, reclaiming projected material, all the rage, selfishness, manipulation, need for control that you've been seeing in others but denying in yourself. Admitting, yes, I have this. I've been expressing it unconsciously through my helping. Sitting with emptiness, learning that you can exist without helping anyone. Discovering who you are when you're not useful. Tolerating the void without filling it. Releasing false identities, the helper, the sensitive one, the wounded healer, the person who understands everyone. All of these masks have to die. You're not eliminating these capacities, you're stopping your identification with them. This stage is so difficult that most people give up and return to old patterns. The pain feels unbearable. The emptiness feels like death. And helping others is right there, available, offering immediate relief from the discomfort. This is why Jung insisted on having a guide, a therapist or analyst who has made this journey and can hold you through it. because you will want to quit. You will think you're going crazy. You will believe the pain will never end. But it will end. The unconscious material is finite. Once you've felt it, grieved it, raged about it, integrated it, it loses its compulsive power over you. The danger of stage 2 is getting stuck in the underworld. Some people descend and never return. They become identified with their wound instead of identified with being a healer. They make their trauma into a permanent identity. Signs you're ready for stage 3. The grief comes less frequently. You have moments of feeling genuinely okay while alone. You notice you can see someone in pain without immediately needing to help them. Your dreams start including light, keys, doors, treasures found in dark places. You feel something new forming inside, though you can't name it yet. Stage 3, integration and rebirth, the transformation. Duration, 2 to 5 years. This stage is characterized by the transcendent function activating. You're able to hold both the wound and the gift simultaneously in consciousness without being possessed by either. You're no longer identified as the wounded child who needs endless healing, and you're no longer identified as the compulsive healer who needs to save everyone. You've become a third thing, a conscious adult human who has survived wounding and has genuine capacity to help, but who chooses when and how to help rather than being driven. Symptoms of stage 3, periods of genuine peace and groundedness, capacity to be alone without anxiety, relationships becoming healthier and more balanced, physical health, improving sense of having a center that's stable, ability to help others without losing yourself, comfortable receiving help from others, less attachment to outcomes dreams. In stage 3, births, babies, animals being born, eggs hatching, mandalas, circles, sacred geometry, balanced symbols, sacred marriages, unions of opposites, finding treasures or keys in dark places, gardens growing, flowers blooming, crossing bridges or thresholds, light emerging from darkness, houses with new rooms discovered. The work of stage 3 is stabilization. The transformation has happened at depth, but now it needs to be integrated into daily life and relationships. Establishing the ego-self axis, you've developed a conscious relationship with the self, the deep organizing center of the psyche. Your ego is no longer trying to control everything or identify with archetypal powers. It's in service to something larger while maintaining its necessary function of navigating daily reality. Practicing conscious helping, you begin helping again, but differently. You can sense the difference between genuine helping and compulsive helping. When someone asks for support, you pause and check internally. Is this mine to do? Can I help without losing myself? Am I being asked, or am I inserting myself? You help when it's appropriate, and you can say no without guilt when it's not. This selectivity feels foreign initially. The old complex whispers, but they need you. But you've learned that your helping isn't always actually helpful, and that others' growth sometimes requires you to stay out of it. Maintaining boundaries. The boundary practices from stage 2 become more natural. You can be with someone in pain without absorbing their pain. You can care deeply without merging. You can hold space without taking responsibility for outcomes. Continuing shadow work. Integration doesn't mean your shadow disappears. It means you recognize it faster when you notice yourself slipping into old patterns, feeling superior, needing to be needed, giving unsolicited advice. You catch it and correct it rather than being possessed by it for weeks or months. Developing reciprocal relationships. You discover you can have relationships where help flows both ways. You can receive care without discomfort. You can be vulnerable without performing woundedness. People relate to you as a whole person, not just as a function. Embodying your authentic self. Who you are underneath the helper role becomes clearer. your actual preferences, needs, gifts, limits, not the idealized helper self, but your real human self with all its ordinariness and specificity. And paradoxically, this feels more real than all the spiritual inflation ever did. The danger of stage 3 is premature return to service. You feel better, the integration is stabilizing, and you think, I'm ready to help again. But if you return too quickly or without proper boundaries, you can regress to stage 1 or 2. Jung was emphatic. Take longer than you think you need. If you think you're ready to return to helping work after 2 years, wait another year. Let the integration deepen. Make sure your helping comes from genuine fullness rather than from feeling guilty about not helping. Signs you're ready for stage 4. You've been stable for at least 6 months. You can help a few people without it triggering old patterns. You have relationships where you're not the helper. You can tolerate people not liking you or being disappointed in you. You've established regular practices that maintain consciousness. Your dreams show stability, less drama, more ordinary life with moments of numinous experience. Stage 4. Return and authentic service. The gift, duration, ongoing. This is the stage of the integrated, wounded healer. You've descended, faced your shadow, integrated your wound, and now you return to the world with genuine medicine to offer. But this stage is called ongoing because it's not a destination, it's a practice. You're never finished. The consciousness you've developed requires maintenance. The wounded healer complex never disappears completely. It remains as a potential that can be reactivated under stress. Characteristics of stage 4. Helping from fullness. You help because you're genuinely moved to help, not because you'll feel empty if you don't. You have a life that's fulfilling, independent of your service. When you do help, you're giving from overflow rather than from depletion. Clear boundaries. You know your limits and honor them. You can work intensely with someone's pain and then close that container and return to your own life. You don't carry people's problems home with you energetically. Comfortable with not being needed. If a client heals and leaves, you feel genuinely happy for them rather than abandoned. If someone chooses not to work with you, you don't take it personally. If people can solve their own problems without you, you celebrate that rather than feeling useless. Shadow awareness. You continue to catch your shadow in action. When you notice the old patterns emerging, wanting to be seen as special, needing admiration for your helping, feeling superior to less aware people, you recognize it and work with it rather than being possessed by it. Reciprocal relationships. Your personal relationships are balanced. You can give and receive. You can be strong and vulnerable. You can be the helper sometimes and the helped other times without it threatening your identity. Ongoing practice. You maintain the practices from earlier stages: shadow inventory, active imagination, boundary work, ethical suffering, not obsessively, but regularly. These practices are your insurance against regression. Teaching from integration. If you teach or guide others, you teach from what you've actually integrated, not from concepts you've learned. You're transparent about your ongoing work. You position yourself as a fellow traveler who happens to be a few steps ahead on certain paths, not as someone who has arrived. Selective service. You're very selective about who you work with and how you work. You recognize that not everyone is your person to help. You trust that the people meant to work with you will find you, and you don't chase or convince anyone. Comfortable with limitation. You've made peace with the fact that you can't save everyone, that your helping has limits, that some people won't heal despite your best efforts, and that this doesn't mean you failed. You've learned to grieve without taking responsibility for outcomes you can't control. Dreams in stage 4. Crossroads, choices, multiple paths. Teaching or guiding but not controlling. Holding keys, opening doors for others. Light in darkness but not blinding light. ordinary life with numinous moments, balance symbols, scales, bridges, mandalas, gardens that require tending, houses that are whole but always have new rooms to discover. The work of stage 4 is maintenance and deepening. You're not coasting on past integration, you're actively maintaining consciousness, because Jung observed that integration can be lost. Under stress, illness, loss, or major life transitions, the wounded healer complex can reactivate. The difference is, now you know the territory. If you find yourself slipping back into compulsive helping, you recognize it faster. If you notice boundary dissolution happening, you catch it earlier. If inflation starts creeping in, you have tools to deflate consciously rather than waiting for catastrophic collapse. Stage 4 wounded healers typically maintain ongoing therapy or supervision for themselves, have regular check-ins with trusted people who can spot their blind spots, take periodic sabbaticals from helping work to recenter, continue practices like shadow inventory and active imagination, belong to communities of other integrated healers who offer mutual accountability. Revisit earlier stages when necessary without shame. This is lifelong work, not because you're broken, but because the wounded healer archetype is powerful, and consciousness is precious and easily lost. Jung lived in stage 4 for the last 40 years of his life. He continued his own analysis. He had periods where shadow material reactivated. He made mistakes in relationships, but he had the consciousness to recognize and work with these patterns rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. He wrote in his final years, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. But to choose, I must first be conscious. And consciousness is not a destination. It is a practice I must return to daily." The complete arc in summary. Stage 1, the helper identity collapses. Crisis forces recognition. 3-6 months of acute awareness that you've been operating as a dark healer. Stage 2, voluntary descent into the wound. Stop helping others. Face your shadow. Feel everything you've been avoiding. 1-3 years of intensive integration work. Stage 3, the wound and gift integrate. Transcendent function activates. You become a third thing, neither identified with victim nor healer, but conscious adult who can choose. 2-5 years of stabilization. Stage 4, return to service transformed. Help from fullness, maintain consciousness, ongoing practice for the rest of your life. Total time from recognition to stable integration. Minimum 3-8 years, often longer. This is why Jung was so serious about this work. It's not a weekend workshop. It's a complete reorientation of personality that requires years of sustained effort. But here's the beautiful part. This journey, as difficult as it is, transforms the curse of the wounded empath into genuine medicine. You don't lose your sensitivity. You integrate it. You don't stop helping. You start helping consciously. You don't eliminate your wound. You make it conscious. And the medicine that emerges from conscious wounding is the most powerful force for transformation in the human experience. Not because you're special, but because you've walked through hell and returned with a map. Because you've faced what most people spend lifetimes avoiding. Because you can hold darkness without being destroyed by it. Because your presence itself becomes medicine, not through doing, but through being someone who has survived their own descent and made it conscious. This is what the world needs. Not more wounded healers operating unconsciously, but integrated wounded healers who can hold space for others' descents without trying to prevent them, who can offer light without eliminating darkness, who can accompany without rescuing. But before you fully step into stage 4, there are critical pitfalls you need to know about. Because even after years of integration work, there are specific traps that can derail the entire process. These pitfalls have destroyed the work of countless wounded healers who had done everything right for years, but then hit one of these snares and regressed completely. Let's map the 5 critical pitfalls so you can recognize and navigate them. Jung discovered that the wounded healer's transformation isn't a smooth upward trajectory. There are specific pitfalls, predictable traps that can derail years of integration work. Many wounded healers do deep work, make genuine progress, then hit one of these snares and regress completely. Understanding these pitfalls in advance doesn't prevent you from encountering them, but it helps you recognize them faster so you can course correct before catastrophic derailment. Pitfall 1. Premature return to healing work. This is the most common pitfall. You've been in stage 2 for a year or more. You've done shadow work, faced your wound, and you're feeling better. The depression has lifted. You have more energy. You can function without the compulsive helping drive. And then you think, I'm ready to help again. I've learned so much through this process. I should share it. People need this. This feels altruistic. It feels like you're being called back to service. But it's often the wounded healer complex reasserting itself in a more sophisticated form. The premature return happens when you start helping before the integration has fully stabilized. You use your new insights as a way to reinflate your helper identity. You return because you feel guilty about not helping, not because you're genuinely full. You convince yourself that teaching about the wounded healer means you've integrated it. Jung's warning about this was severe. If you return prematurely, you will regress. And often the regression is worse than the original complex, because now you have the appearance of integration without the reality of it. Signs you're in premature return. You're teaching about transformation you haven't fully integrated yet. You feel urgent about sharing what you've learned. You're attracted to helping others through their wounded healer process before you've completed your own. You can talk brilliantly about integration, but your actual relationships and life circumstances show the complex is still operating. You're getting narcissistic supply from being the one who did the work. The consequence? The unconscious will force you back into descent, usually through illness, relationship collapse, or a helping situation that goes catastrophically wrong. The psyche won't let you skip stages. How to navigate. Wait longer than you think you need to. Jung recommended waiting until you've been stable for at least a year before returning to any formal helping role. And even then, start small. Maybe seeing 1 or 2 people, watching carefully for signs of the old pattern reactivating. Get supervision or ongoing therapy throughout the return process. Have someone who can spot when you're slipping back into complex before you can see it yourself. And check your motivation ruthlessly. Are you helping because you're genuinely full and have something to offer? Or are you helping because not helping makes you feel guilty, useless, or empty? If it's the latter, you're not ready. Pitfall 2. Spiritual inflation during integration. This pitfall happens during stage 2 or 3. You're doing the deep work. You're having breakthrough experiences. You're integrating shadow material. Dreams are getting more numinous. You feel like you're accessing deeper levels of consciousness. And then the ego mistakes this integration process for enlightenment or special spiritual status. You start to believe you're spiritually advanced because you've faced your shadow. You develop subtle or not so subtle superiority about your level of awareness. You begin to position yourself as someone who gets it while others are still asleep. This is inflation disguised as integration. You haven't transcended the wounded healer complex. You've just moved it into spiritual territory. Jung saw this constantly in people undergoing analysis. They'd have genuine experiences of the self, of archetypal reality, of the numinous. But instead of humbly integrating these experiences, they'd identify with them. I'm enlightened. I've done the work. I'm more conscious than most people. This spiritual inflation is often accompanied by Developing a teaching persona before integration is complete. Attracting followers or students who see you as a guru. Subtle contempt for people who haven't done the work. Using spiritual language to bypass ongoing shadow work, believing you've arrived somewhere permanent rather than recognizing integration as ongoing practice. The danger is enormous because spiritual inflation feels good. It feels like you've achieved something, and it's much harder to recognize than the obvious wounded healer pattern because it's dressed in the language of consciousness and growth. The consequence? Enantiodromia, the swing into the opposite. The inflated spiritual seeker eventually crashes into deflation, often publicly and humiliatingly. The guru is revealed to have massive shadow. The enlightened one is exposed as still deeply wounded. The teacher is caught doing exactly what they teach others not to do. How to navigate. Maintain absolute honesty about where you actually are. Jung's test was simple. Can you admit you don't know? Can you say, I'm still working on this, without shame? Can you recognize ongoing shadow material without denying it or explaining it away? Stay in regular therapy or analysis throughout the integration process. You need an outside perspective to spot inflation because from inside it, inflation feels like truth. And practice what Jung called active deflation, deliberately reminding yourself of your ordinariness, your limitations, your ongoing work. Not from self-hatred, but from realistic self-assessment. You're a human being having some breakthrough experiences in therapy, not a specially chosen enlightened being. Pitfall 3, withdrawal into isolation. This pitfall typically occurs in stage 2. You've withdrawn from helping roles to do your own work. You've set boundaries. You've recognized that many of your relationships were based on you being a function rather than a person. And then the withdrawal becomes permanent. You use the legitimate need for space during integration as justification for complete isolation from human connection. You tell yourself, I need to focus on me. Relationships are just codependence. I don't want to be enmeshed anymore. I'm better off alone. This isn't integration, it's the shadow of individuation. Jung called this the hermit complex. The person withdraws from all relationship to avoid the risk of falling back into old patterns. But they end up trapped in isolation, which is its own pathology. Signs you're in this pitfall. Years of integration work, but no intimate relationships. Justifying isolation as healthy boundaries. Believing that all helping or emotional support is codependent inability to be vulnerable with anyone. Contempt for people who are still enmeshed in relationships. Using individuation language to rationalize fear of connection. The consequence? The psyche needs relationship. Humans are relational beings. Extended isolation creates its own distortions. You may avoid codependence, but you develop other pathologies, paranoia, rigidity, inability to compromise, loss of empathy, emotional flatness. Jung observed that people in this pitfall often convince themselves they've transcended the need for relationship, but they've actually just swung to the opposite extreme, from enmeshment to avoidance, from no boundaries to walls. How to navigate. Recognize that healthy individuation includes relationship, not enmeshed codependent relationship, but genuine connection between two differentiated people. As you stabilize in stage 3, gradually experiment with relationship. Start small, maybe one friendship where you practice being vulnerable without being the helper. See if you can receive support without feeling controlled. Test whether you can care about someone without losing yourself. The goal isn't to return to old relationship patterns. It's to discover that you can have intimacy with boundaries, care without codependence, love without merger. But this requires actually engaging with people rather than theorizing about it from isolation. Jung's measure of integration wasn't how well you could function alone. It was whether you could maintain yourself in relationship. The true test of boundaries is whether they hold when someone you love is in pain and you choose conscious presence over compulsive rescuing. Pitfall 4. Martyrdom to the process. This pitfall involves identifying with the suffering of integration itself. You've been doing the work for years. It's been painful, difficult, lonely, and at some point, you start to make that suffering into an identity. I'm going through the dark night of the soul. I'm in my underworld initiation. I'm dying to my false self. These statements may be accurate, but when you identify with them, when you start to need the process to be hard to feel, like you're doing it right, you've created a new version of the wounded healer complex. Now, instead of getting your identity from helping others, you're getting it from your own dramatic transformation process. The wound has become sacred, the suffering has become special, and unconsciously, you resist completion because completion would mean losing this identity. Jung called this being stuck in the underworld. You've descended, but you refuse to return. You've become attached to being in process, being in crisis, being in transformation. Signs you're in this pitfall. Years of therapy with no real change in life, circumstances, stories about your transformation process that position you as special resistance to actually feeling better because it might mean you're bypassing, collecting trauma and transformation frameworks without applying them, identifying as wounded rather than as someone who was wounded and is integrating, using psychological or spiritual language to justify remaining stuck. The consequence? You create a permanent identity around being in transformation, which prevents actual transformation. The process becomes the point rather than a means to integration. You've replaced compulsive helping with compulsive self-work, but it's the same addiction to process over presence. How to navigate? Jung's question was, are you attached to your wound? If the answer is yes, if your wound has become your identity, your story, your way of feeling special or deep or interesting, then you need to let it go. This doesn't mean denying your wound or pretending it didn't happen. It means recognizing that you are not your wound. You were wounded, you felt it, you integrated it, and now you're something else. The wound is part of your history, not your identity. Set a timeline for your integration work, not rigid, but intentional. I'm giving this another year of intensive work, and then I'm experimenting with living as if I'm integrated, even if it doesn't feel complete. Often, the final stage of integration requires acting as if you're whole before you feel whole. And notice when you're performing your transformation rather than living it. Talking about your journey on social media, teaching about your process before it's complete, needing others to witness your suffering. These are signs you've made the wound sacred and are resisting completion. Pitfall 5. Relapse into codependence. This is the most insidious pitfall because it happens after apparent success. You've done years of integration work. You've returned to service in healthy ways. You're maintaining boundaries with clients or students. Everything seems stable. And then you enter an intimate relationship, romantic partnership, deep friendship, parenting, and the wounded healer complex reactivates in full force. You thought you'd integrated it, but you'd only integrated it in professional contexts or casual relationships. In intimacy, where the stakes are higher and the attachment is deeper, the old patterns come roaring back. Suddenly you're feeling responsible for your partner's emotional state, unable to tolerate their distress without trying to fix it, losing yourself in their needs, giving advice they didn't ask for, feeling anxious when they're not okay, making their healing your project, crossing boundaries you'd maintain with anyone else. This happens because intimate relationships activate our earliest attachment wounds, the material that created the wounded healer complex in the first place. You can have integrated the complex in adult professional relationships, but romantic or parental love triggers the original wound and the defense mechanism. Jung observed this in his own life. He'd done extensive integration work, but his marriage and relationships with certain women reactivated patterns he thought he'd resolved. He had to do multiple rounds of integration at deeper levels. The consequence: the relapse can be so complete that it feels like you never did any integration work. You're back to compulsive caretaking, boundary dissolution, martyrdom, resentment, all of it. And the shame of relapse can be devastating. I thought I'd healed this. I've done years of work. Why am I back here? How to navigate. First, recognize that relapse doesn't mean you failed. It means you've hit a deeper layer of the complex that couldn't be accessed until you were in intimate relationship. Second, don't try to handle it alone. Get back into therapy or supervision immediately. The relapse needs outside perspective because from inside it, everything feels urgent and true. Third, apply everything you learned in earlier stages, but in this new context. Shadow inventory specifically about the intimate relationship. Active imagination with the parts that are activated. Boundary practices that you maintain even with someone you love. Ethical suffering, sitting with your discomfort about their pain without fixing it. Fourth, be transparent with your partner or the person you're in relationship with. I'm recognizing old patterns coming up. I need to work on this. It's not about you. It's about my historical wound being triggered by intimacy. This vulnerability actually strengthens intimacy while protecting against codependence. Jung's observation was that integration happens in layers. Each new level of intimacy, responsibility, or stress can reveal material you couldn't access before. This isn't failure, it's the nature of depth work. The goal isn't to never have the wounded healer complex activate again. The goal is to recognize it faster, address it more consciously, and return to balance more quickly. The relapses get shorter, less destructive, more manageable. But only if you're vigilant. Only if you maintain practices. Only if you stay humble about the power of unconscious complexes. Navigating all 5 pitfalls, core principles. Across all these pitfalls, certain principles help navigate safely. Maintain outside perspective. Stay in therapy, supervision, or community with others who can spot your blind spots. You cannot see your own complex clearly when you're in it. Practice brutal honesty. The wounded healer complex survives through self-deception and rationalization. Counter it with relentless honesty about your actual motivations and patterns. Expect cyclical work. Integration isn't one and done. You'll revisit these issues at deeper levels throughout your life. This is normal, not failure. Stay grounded in reality. Your relationships, your health, your actual life circumstances reveal the truth about your integration more than your feelings or beliefs do. If your life shows chaos, enmeshment, or isolation, you're not integrated yet, regardless of how much insight you have. Remember, consciousness is the goal, not perfection, not elimination of the complex. Consciousness, the ability to recognize the pattern and choose differently in the moment. Jung spent the last decades of his life warning about these pitfalls because he saw so many gifted healers derailed by them. The wounded healer path is treacherous precisely because the complex is so sophisticated at protecting itself. But with awareness of these pitfalls, with ongoing practice, with humility and persistence, navigation is possible. And on the other side of successful navigation lies something extraordinary: the integrated wounded healer who has genuinely transformed their curse into medicine. In the final section, we're bringing the entire journey full circle. We're returning to Sarah's story to see her complete transformation. We're elevating to the collective level to understand why integrated wounded healers are crucial for humanity. and we're offering the final empowerment that allows you to fully step into this work. Let's close this 3-hour journey with resolution, meaning, and activation. We began this journey with Sarah, the healer whose gift became a curse, whose helping became harm, whose 3 clients' suicides forced her to face what she'd been fleeing her entire life. Let's return to her story and see what became possible when she walked the complete wounded healer transformation arc. Sarah's transformation, the return. When we left Sarah in Section 3, she was in the depths of Stage 2, withdrawn from her practice, living in a cabin in Washington, facing the childhood trauma she'd been managing through her clients for years. The 2 years that followed were the hardest of her life, harder than the abuse, harder than the clients' deaths, because now she was consciously feeling everything she'd been unconsciously avoiding. She had to face what her Uncle James had done to her. Not intellectually, she'd always known about the abuse in an abstract way, but somatically, viscerally, feeling the 8-year-old's terror and violation in her adult body. She had to feel the rage at her mother for not protecting her, for being so absorbed in her own mental illness that she couldn't see what was happening to her daughter. She had to grieve the childhood she didn't have, the safety, the innocence, the right to be a child rather than the family's emotional manager. And most devastatingly, she had to face her own shadow, the ways she'd unconsciously recreated the power dynamic of her abuse through her client relationships. She'd been the Uncle James figure, not sexually, but energetically, using vulnerable people to meet her own unmet needs, while framing it as helping them. This recognition almost destroyed her. She attempted suicide once during this period, not from depression, but from the overwhelming shame of recognizing she'd become a version of what had traumatized her. But Dr. Hoffman held her through it. And slowly, the acute crisis phase passed. The grief came in waves rather than tsunamis. The rage could be felt and released rather than stored. The shame could be examined rather than denied. Around the 3-year mark, something shifted. Sarah had a dream that marked the turning point. She's in her childhood home, but it's different. Lighter, cleaner. She walks upstairs to her old bedroom. The door is closed. She's terrified to open it because she knows the 8-year-old is in there, still frozen in that trauma. But when she opens the door, the room is empty. No little girl, just sunlight through the window and a note on the bed that says, "I'm not there anymore. I'm here now." And Sarah woke up crying, but not grief tears, relief tears. The frozen child wasn't frozen anymore. She'd finally been brought forward, integrated, welcomed into Sarah's conscious adult self. After that dream, Sarah's transformation accelerated. She began to feel like an actual person rather than a fragmented collection of helper role and wounded child parts. She developed preferences, boundaries, a sense of self that existed independent of being useful to anyone. She also began to genuinely like herself, not in an inflated way, but in a simple, "I'm okay to be around" way. This was revolutionary. The wounded healer is always performing lovability through helpfulness. Sarah was discovering she was lovable just as herself, doing nothing for anyone. She stayed in the cabin for another year, but now she was living rather than just surviving. She hiked. She read novels instead of therapy books. She adopted a dog and discovered she could care for another being without losing herself. She made friends with locals who had no idea about her past or her profession. They just knew her as Sarah, the woman from California who liked bad coffee and good silence. In year 4 of her integration, she began seeing clients again, but only 3 at a time. Only people who explicitly resonated with her specific gifts and limitations. She was radically transparent in consultations. I'm a wounded healer who has done intensive integration work. I can hold space for your healing, but I cannot and will not take responsibility for your outcomes. I have clear boundaries. I will call you on your patterns, and I will not be available between sessions except for emergencies. Half the people who consulted with her decided she wasn't the right fit. Sarah celebrated this. The old wounded healer would have tried to convince them, would have needed them to choose her. The integrated Sarah understood that selective service is conscious service. The clients she did work with had profound results, not because Sarah had magical powers, but because she could hold space without projection. She could feel their pain without taking it on. She could challenge them without controlling them. She could celebrate their growth without feeling abandoned. Most importantly, when clients completed their work with her and graduated, Sarah felt genuine joy. No abandonment panic, no subtle sabotage to keep them coming back. Just honest happiness that they'd found what they needed and could move forward. This is the marker of the integrated wounded healer. You can let people leave. Sarah never returned to the intensity of her former practice. She works part-time. She has a life outside her work. She's in a relationship with someone who doesn't need healing. They're just two whole people choosing companionship. She has friendships where she sometimes receives help rather than always giving it. Her Instagram account, which once had 45,000 followers, was deleted. She has no interest in building a following or teaching masses. She works with a few people deeply. That's enough. When we last interviewed Sarah for this case study, she said something that captures the entire wounded healer transformation. I used to think my gift was feeling everyone's pain. Now I know my gift is that I survived my own pain and made it conscious. That consciousness is what actually helps. Not my empathy, not my sensitivity, my consciousness. This is the resolution of the wounded healer arc. The gift and the wound integrate into consciousness, and consciousness becomes the medicine. The collective importance. Why this matters for humanity. Sarah's transformation is one story, but Jung's observations extended far beyond individual healing. He understood that the wounded healer dynamic operates at every level of human organization, personal, familial, cultural, political, global, and he believed that humanity's greatest crises stem from wounded healers in positions of power who never integrated their wounds. Consider political leaders who help their nations by creating enemies to unite against, projecting their own shadow onto external threats. Religious leaders who save followers while creating psychological dependence and shame. Parents who love their children by controlling every aspect of their development. Therapists who keep clients dependent to avoid their own emptiness. Activists who fight injustice while unconsciously perpetuating other forms of harm. Teachers who inspire students while subtly preventing them from surpassing the teacher. The wounded healer who hasn't integrated their wound doesn't just harm individuals. They create systems that perpetuate harm across generations. Jung saw this playing out historically. He watched Germany's collective wounded healer complex manifest as Nazism, a nation wounded by World War I, turning its pain into genocidal projection. He saw it in religious wars, in colonial violence justified as civilizing missions, in every imperial project that claimed to be helping while actually exploiting. And he understood that these collective manifestations won't end until enough individual wounded healers do their integration work. Because integrated wounded healers become something the world desperately needs. Leaders, teachers, healers, and parents who can hold space for collective pain without trying to fix it prematurely or use it for personal power. Recognize their own capacity for darkness, which makes them less likely to project it onto enemies. Help others become autonomous rather than dependent. can tolerate ambiguity, complexity, and not knowing without resorting to dogmatic certainty, lead from genuine care rather than from unmet childhood needs, create spaces for transformation without becoming gurus or saviors. Jung believed that if enough wounded healers did this work, humanity could transform at the collective level, not into perfection, into consciousness, into a species that recognizes its shadow, owns its capacity for harm, and chooses differently moment by moment. This is why your individual integration work matters far beyond your personal healing. You're not just healing yourself. You're participating in the healing of the collective wounded healer complex that's been perpetuating harm for millennia. Every wounded healer who integrates rather than inflates becomes a node of consciousness in the collective network. Every parent who faces their wound instead of passing it to their children breaks a generational cycle. Every therapist who does their own work before helping others creates genuine healing space rather than perpetuating trauma. Every leader who acknowledges their shadow becomes less dangerous and more trustworthy. You are part of this. Your choice to face your wounded healer complex rather than avoid it ripples outward in ways you'll never fully see. The clients or loved ones who heal because you didn't recreate trauma with them will impact others, who will impact others, spiraling outward exponentially. Jung's vision wasn't naive optimism. He didn't believe everyone would integrate or that humanity would achieve collective enlightenment, but he believed that each person who chooses consciousness over unconsciousness tips the scales slightly toward wholeness. And right now, the world needs this desperately. We need leaders who won't become tyrants, teachers who won't create cults, parents who won't devour their children, healers who won't perpetuate wounds, activists who won't mirror the violence they oppose. We need integrated wounded healers in every sphere of human activity, and that starts with you doing your own work. Final empowerment, your invitation to begin. If you've made it this far, 3 hours into this exploration of the wounded healer's journey, you're not here by accident. Something in you recognized yourself in this material, maybe uncomfortably, maybe painfully, maybe with the simultaneous relief and horror of being seen.